This is something that happened recently when I was working at Subway. I've worked here for almost a year now, and I work in a Subway that I would describe as average. We're not in a super busy area, but we're also not in the middle of nowhere. So one day, at a quiet time in the afternoon, this man came in. I was working behind the counter, and there wasn't anybody else in the store at the time, except for my coworker who was in the back. I'm guessing that it was like 2 or 3 p.m., kind of between the rush of lunch and dinner when it was quiet. So the man walked in and came to the spot where you start to order. When I asked him what he wanted, he said that he wanted one of the $5 footlongs. Right away, the guy did not seem to be in the greatest of moods. I asked him what kind of bread he wanted and started to go towards the breads to get a footlong. But before he answered, I thought I should tell him that the footlongs are not $5 anymore. In fact, I'm pretty sure that the $5 footlong promotion hasn't been around in at least 10 years. When I told him this, the man was not happy about it at all. I kind of thought the guy was half joking when he said it in the first place, because it's been so long, but apparently he wasn't. He asked me what the price was, and when I told him, he basically started going on a rant. He said how we always advertised the $5 footlong for so long, and claimed that the last time he went to Subway he had got one. Well, I don't know when exactly that was. It could have been years ago, but we certainly never had $5 footlongs in the time that I worked at this Subway. I told him that I didn't make the prices, I just worked here. He started saying how he was going to call up Subway corporate and he was going to call my manager and stuff. I really didn't know what the guy's problem was. Finally, he asked me how cheap I was willing to go on the price of the sandwich, as if I was selling something to him at a pawn shop. I told him that I couldn't negotiate the price, I didn't have that kind of power. The man then cursed at me, which made me angry, and I yelled at him to get out, but this only made him more upset. He started ranting again about Subway and me, and ended it by saying that I should be fired. I told him to leave or I was going to call the cops on him. My coworker, who had been in the back, now finally came out to see what was causing the commotion. He also told the man to leave. Finally, the guy leaned into me and said that he would be back for me, whatever that meant. Then he turned and stormed out. It was the craziest thing. My coworker and I talked about the incident for a while. We were just glad that the guy was gone. Soon, we got some other customers and went on with the day. It got busy for a while in the evening, and then it quieted down again at night. My coworker left and went home, and then I was alone to close the store. Normally, things would be very quiet in the last hour. So we got probably just one customer in the final hour that we were open that night. Then at 9 o'clock, we were closed. I went over and locked the door, then headed back to clean up before I could leave. But as I was doing so, I suddenly heard the sound of someone trying to open the door. I looked up and saw the same man from earlier who was angry about the $5 footlong. I got a bad feeling when I saw him. He stood at the door and then started loudly knocking on it. He saw me behind the counter and then started to yell at me. I yelled at him to go away and said that we were closed. The man yelled something else, but I couldn't really understand it. Then I went into the back. I hoped that the guy would go away. I did some cleaning in the back area and didn't hear him for a little while. When I came back though, he was still there. Now he was just kind of pacing back and forth on the sidewalk out front. It didn't seem like he was going to leave. I finished up all the things that I had to do and then I was ready to go. But when I did, the man was still there pacing back and forth out front. I knew that he was waiting for me, so at that point, I called the police. I told them the story of the guy and how he was out front. Then I just waited. When the police got there, the man was still out front. They talked to him and eventually got him to leave. After that, I was finally able to go home. Looking back at that situation, I feel lucky that I locked the doors right at 9 p.m. when we closed. The man got there just minutes later. If he had gotten inside the restaurant, I don't know what would have happened. Since that incident, I haven't seen the guy, and I'm hoping that I never do again. I own a house, and I live by myself in it. I've not lived there for really that long, maybe 6 months. This is something that happened just a few weeks ago now. So for some background, I've always considered the neighborhood to be very average. It's not like a wealthy area, but it's also not known to be a bad neighborhood. Most of the people that I've met have been really nice. Of course, I didn't meet all my neighbors, but just a few. In the entire 6 months or so that I've lived in my house, everything has been fine, except for one night. A couple of weeks ago, like I mentioned, something really strange happened. I was in my living room sitting on my couch late one night. I think it was about 11 p.m. All of a sudden, my doorbell rang like 3 or 4 times in a row. It was really surprising. I didn't know why somebody would be at my house this late. I got up from the couch and walked over to the door. When I got there, I looked out of the window and nobody was there. I even opened up the door and went out onto the front step. I looked around but didn't see anybody. So then I went back inside of my house. But just a minute later, there was a knock on the front door. It was very loud, and I went over to the door again. But once more, whoever had knocked was gone. At this point, I figured that it was probably some neighborhood kids ding-dong ditching me. I thought they probably wouldn't come back. I waited around by the front door for a little while anyways, though. After a few minutes, nobody came back, so I finally returned to the living room. Maybe 10 minutes after this, there was a loud banging on the front door again. This time, I heard them knocking on a front window as well. I ran from the living room as fast as I could to get over to the front door. When I arrived, the people had stopped, but I was just able to see them running away. I saw what appeared to be 3 grown men running from the end of my driveway and into the street. I had figured it to be teenagers, but these guys looked a little older. Still, it was probably just a harmless prank. But the fact that one of them was banging on the front window next to the door this time was a little bit weird. After 10 minutes went by with nothing, I returned to the other room again. Some more time went by, and I actually thought that they were gone for good now. By this time, it was getting really late. But then they came back yet again, and this time was the worst by far. I first heard a really loud knock at the front door. I started running over there again, and as I was doing so, I suddenly heard the sound of glass breaking. When I arrived near the front door, I saw that the window in my front door had been broken. There was glass on the ground, and this made me so angry that I ran over to the door and went outside. I saw the same 3 men running away into the street. I ran through my front yard and into the street after them. They were pretty far ahead of me, but I saw them go into a house that was almost at the end of the street. After they all went inside, I kept going down the street until I got to the house. My plan was to confront them. This was not a silly joke anymore, but now a crime. Their house was probably the worst looking one on the entire street. I walked up to the front door and knocked on it, but nobody responded. I continued to knock on their door, and I wasn't going to go away. After I was knocking for a few minutes, I heard somebody yell from inside for me to leave. I yelled back that they broke my window. There was a few minutes of nothing. But then, I heard somebody coming from behind the house. There was a person out in the yard. I couldn't see much because they had no porch light there or anything. Moments after hearing whoever it was get to the side of the house, I looked over, and then I heard something whiz past my head and hit a bush. Somebody threw a rock at me. Then another one nearly hit me, and instead hit the side of the house. I turned around and started running away. When I was sprinting off the property, I heard at least 2 people laughing, which made me really mad. Still, I couldn't stay there. I got back to my house and was not chased or anything. Once I was there, I called the police. They came out a short time later, and after showing them my window and telling them what had happened, they went over to the neighbors. Apparently, about 5 adults lived in that house, and most of them were drug addicts. They had multiple illegal drugs inside of the house, so when the cops showed up at the front door, they panicked and one guy tried running away. The police ended up going inside and finding the drugs, and multiple people were arrested. I also pressed charges against them for both throwing rocks at me and breaking my window. Shortly after that, the house was sold to new owners who turned the place around. I used to live in this old apartment building. My name is Sabrina, and this took place about 5 years ago now. My place had 1 bedroom and 1.5 bathrooms. Overall, it was not the greatest, but I didn't mind it. I was on the 2nd floor, and there were lots of other people living in the building. But several months after I had started living there, I got a new next-door neighbor. His name was Arthur, and he was a creep from almost the very start. I know that the way he met me was strange enough. I left my apartment and was walking down the hallway. He came up behind me and tapped me on the shoulder, startling me. Then he introduced himself, and it was really awkward. He told me that he lived next door and stuff, and from that point I thought maybe he was just an awkward guy. But he spoke to me a couple more times and didn't really seem shy or anything. In fact, the next time that I saw him, he was just standing out in the hallway, not really seeming to be going anywhere. When I left my place, he approached me and asked me if I wanted to come over to his place. I said that I was busy and I had to go somewhere, and I declined. After this, Arthur tried to ask me out a couple of times when he saw me in the hallway, but I said no each time. He struck me as a little bit odd and creepy. All of these interactions with him happened within the first month that he lived there. It was starting to get annoying, because it seemed like almost half the time that I left my place, he would leave after me or be in the hallway. And one night, I was in my apartment and went to take out my trash. We did not have a trash chute on my floor, and we had to walk all the way down to the basement to take it out. So I got on my flip-flops and left my place and walked down to the basement. I was gone for maybe 2 or 3 minutes at most. Then I returned to my apartment and went back inside of it. It was kind of late at this point, and I was tired, so I decided to get ready for bed. I wasn't necessarily planning to go to sleep right away, but probably just watch some shows in bed. So I started to go around and turn all the lights off in my place. When I passed by my broom closet, I was sure that I heard a noise inside of it. This was very weird. I didn't know what it could be. The last thing that I was expecting was for a person to be in there. But when I opened the door, I saw Arthur standing right inside. I jumped back and started running for my bedroom. Arthur emerged from the broom closet and then actually started going after me. After I got inside my bedroom, I slammed the door shut, but I didn't have enough time to lock it. Arthur was there within seconds, and I saw him starting to open the door. I had the half bathroom attached to my bedroom, and I ran for that door. I got inside and shut the door behind me just after Arthur had gotten inside of my bedroom. This door had a slightly different lock, and I was just able to lock it on time before Arthur reached. He then tried opening the door and then started banging on it. Fortunately, I had my cell phone in my pocket. I dialed 911 as fast as I could. Neither Arthur or me said anything in this time. After trying to open the bathroom door multiple times, Arthur then started banging on it. I finally spoke and yelled that I had called the police. Then I talked to the 911 operator. I told her exactly what was going on. In this time, Arthur finally walked away from the bathroom door. However, I couldn't tell if he had left my apartment or was just in the other room, so I stayed hidden in the bathroom. It felt like forever that I was waiting until the police showed up. In that time, I didn't hear anything, and when they got there, I finally came out of the bathroom, but Arthur was not in my apartment anywhere. I told the police where he lived, which was obviously right next door, but Arthur had left. Eventually, though, the police were able to locate him. Apparently, he had gotten into similar trouble in the past and had a bit of a history. I obviously didn't lock my door when I went to take out the trash that night. Arthur must have just walked right in and hid in my closet. I'm glad that I found him when I did, even though that made for one of the scariest moments of my life. One time last year, I went to a Subway at night. I was just going to get a sub, and the Subway restaurant was only about 5 minutes from my house. It was located in a quiet strip mall that had several other businesses in it. So I went there at probably about 8 p.m. I remember that it was completely dark out because it was the springtime, and the area was also pretty quiet. Most of the other businesses in the strip mall were now closed. I walked inside of the Subway and I ordered. It didn't take very long because nobody else was there, and then I got my sandwich. I remember that when I was getting a drink from the fountain, I noticed a man passing by on the sidewalk out front, outside of the Subway. The man was somewhat tall, had shaggy-looking hair, and was wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants. So I remember that he looked in the window at me as he was passing by, but then he continued walking and went out of sight. After I got my drink and stuff, I walked out and I left the Subway. I was starting to walk to my car in the parking lot when I heard somebody approaching me. There were footsteps a little behind me and to my right. I looked over and I saw the same man. He was approaching me, and before I knew it, the man was right next to me. I stopped to see what the guy wanted. When I did, he asked me if I could give him a ride over to the gas station and pointed in the direction. The way he pointed, there was a gas station within sight, and it really wasn't that far away at all. It was kind of in the direction of where I lived too. Obviously, I didn't want to give this man a ride though. I didn't know him or anything, so I said to the guy that I was in a hurry to get home. But as I started to walk away, the man followed. He said that it wasn't far, and he just needed to go to the gas station and was meeting a friend there. I finally said yes and told the man that I would give him a ride. I feel stupid saying that, because obviously it's not smart to give a ride to a random person you first see at night. But that's what I did, and I was just hoping that it would be a quick drive to drop the man off. I mean, it would take less than a minute to get to the gas station, and it was within sight. It was just a little bit to the left of the strip mall and almost behind it. And the gas station was open, and there looked to be several other cars there. So the man got in the passenger side of my car, and I got in the driver's seat. After getting inside, the man was nice and said thank you to me, and said that he was really cold and didn't want to walk all that way. It was pretty cold out with it being the early spring and nighttime. So I left the parking lot of the strip mall where the subway was. Then I drove out of the parking lot onto a busier street. After we went to the left, the gas station was just to the right, but the entire drive, neither me or the man said anything. It was just awkward silence. After I turned into the gas station, I pulled into a parking space in the back side of the parking lot. It had been a quick and easy drive. When I stopped though, the man did not immediately get out of my car. So I said something like, "All right, have a good night now." But he didn't get out. He just sat there. It was really awkward for like 30 seconds, and I was getting a bad feeling about this whole situation. At this point, I was kicking myself for letting a stranger get in my car at all. So finally, I said to the man, "We're here. Isn't this where you wanted to go?" The man finally spoke. He said this wasn't the correct gas station. He said it was another one that was a ways down the road, and he pointed to the east. That was not the direction that I was going. I thought the man needed to go to this gas station, and I was sure that's where he pointed. I told him this is where I thought he was going, and he said no, as if I was stupid for thinking that. I told him that I was not going in that direction and I had to go home now. He didn't respond, and he didn't get out either. This man seemed really annoyed with me that I somehow didn't know exactly where he was going. I told him I couldn't go there, and I wasn't going any further. He did not seem happy about it, and did not get out of my car. The man told me to drive him to the other gas station. I was getting pretty nervous. I didn't know if this guy could possibly be dangerous or something like that. I asked him to get out of my car, and he said no. At this point, I didn't really know what to do. Then, as we were sitting there, I noticed a police car pulling into the gas station. When I saw this, I was thinking maybe I should try to get the cops' attention. But as I was still thinking that, the man next to me suddenly got out of my car. He opened the door, left my vehicle, and then started quickly walking away. The guy started heading towards the building, and then I just left. I went home, and I told myself that I would never let a stranger in my car again. Looking back, I'm not sure what that guy was planning to do. I figured that when he saw the cop, he knew he was up to no good, and he left. I'm really glad that the police officer pulled into the parking lot when he did.
So, this was a few years ago, but I'm pretty sure it's the creepiest encounter with a stranger I've had in my life. I've never really written about a personal experience like this, and I don't know if you all will find it as weird as I did, or if I'm overreacting, but I thought this would be the place to share it. My friend and I were at my house and found ourselves craving fast food. I live about a half a mile from a Burger King, a place my friends and I had walked to on previous occasions. It was nearing dusk, but my neighborhood was generally safe, and I had never felt uncomfortable or unsafe walking around here before. The weather was mild for December, so we decided to walk to the nearby Burger King rather than drive. For some background information, my friend and I are both 16-year-old girls. We have both had encounters with creepers in the past, but my resting bitch face has deterred a lot of unwanted advances. My friend had a pepper spray canister in her purse, though she left it at home, I guess because we were so comfortable in my neighborhood that we didn't think anything odd would happen. When we arrived at the Burger King, it was oddly desolate for dinner time. The only people in the restaurant were the workers, an old Italian man who seemed to be the franchise owner, and a middle-aged African-American man sitting in the corner, facing the window. The way the building is set up, you order your food around the corner from the seating area, and those at the cash register cannot easily see those seated in the restaurant. There's a side door that leads directly into the dining area, allowing people to enter and exit without being seen by the cashiers. As we were ordering our milkshakes and fries, the owner was screaming at the young employees, which made my friend and I pretty uncomfortable. When our food was ready, he brought it to the counter and leered at us, asking us if we had just been to the beach. Neither of us was dressed particularly provocatively, and I just gave him a dirty look and sat down to eat my food, thinking that he was probably the creepiest person I was going to meet that day. When my friend and I sat down to eat, the man who was seated in the corner got up to leave. We barely looked at him, but when he was passing our table, my friend and I noticed an odd detail. Though he was middle-aged and was wearing what looked to be a work uniform, he had bright, neon green contact lenses in his eyes, the kind people wear with Halloween costumes. I giggled to my friend that he must really like Hobson, a rapper whose persona includes wearing white contact lenses, but we didn't find it too strange until he came back in the side door 3 minutes later. When he came back in, he was carrying a misshapen large bag. He was previously seated very far from us, but when he came back, he took a seat closest to us, 2 or 3 feet away. The tables were angled differently, so his back was facing us. We thought this was weird, but we continued eating while he pulled out an ancient laptop from his bag and started it up. A few moments later, my friend grabbed my leg and made a motion for me to look next to me. There, it was clear the man had positioned the laptop screen so that my friend and I could see it. I heard his heavy breathing before I fully grasped what was happening. There, on his Windows Media Player screen, were 2 naked women in what seemed to be a dungeon, restrained and being whipped by a third woman in a rubber suit. Now, I'm familiar with computers and have friends who joke about such things, so I've come across explicit content before. However, this was far from ordinary bondage material. It seemed less staged and more amateurish, and the fact that he had it stored on a disk rather than accessing it online made it all the more unsettling. What heightened the unease was that he was gradually increasing the volume on his laptop. By the time my friend and I fully grasped the situation and decided to leave, the sound was at maximum volume, and the disturbing sounds of the woman's distress echoed through the dimly lit restaurant. Of course, while this was happening, the manager was still yelling at his employees, and they were completely oblivious to what was going on. My friend and I didn't stop to tell them what was happening, and we booked it out of there, running across a busy intersection. I looked back to see the man getting up and walking out of the Burger King, into what can only be described as a stereotypical black creeper van. I told my friend this, and we began to panic and ran into a nearby gas station. The van drove into the parking lot and sat there. We hid inside for almost half an hour, and the employees probably thought we were shoplifting, but we were too scared to make the walk home with this weirdo on the loose. Eventually, the van drove off, and we peeked outside to make sure the coast was clear. By this time, it was completely dark. I called my best guy friend and asked him to come pick us up, but he was across town. My friend and I just stayed on the phone with him as we began the trek back to my house, which, though short, when paranoid, seemed endless. When we got home, we speculated on the man's intentions and thanked our lucky stars that he didn't grab us on our walk back. Sleeping proved difficult for me that night. The man's unsettling green eyes and his ominous black van haunted my dreams. It really sucks not feeling safe in your own neighborhood. I think it was probably exciting for him to scare young girls, and his behavior might have been a form of exhibitionism. If any of you have experienced something similar, or know about instances where individuals forced others to watch explicit content in public, I'd appreciate hearing about it. This entire experience has left me thoroughly puzzled.
This happened to me and my wife a few months after we moved into a new place. This took place back in November of 2018, and actually wasn't even fully resolved until just recently. So back at this point in time, me and my wife were going through some hard times. I was making money through some slightly illegal means and had actually gone to jail for 9 months. I got out in September of 2018, and I had a job in the city waiting for me when I got home. Now, when I got out of jail, my wife was living with her mom about an hour away from the city, but she knew we had to find somewhere to live close to both of our jobs that were downtown in the city that we were moving to. Since we were starting all over after the legal fees, lawyers, fines, and other assorted debts, we knew we could only afford something super cheap that would let us pay week to week instead of having to pay security deposits and monthly rent up front. We found a boarding house in our city and checked it out. There were 4 rooms in the house with a shared kitchen and bathroom for everyone. We moved into one of the rooms. Our neighbors on the first floor were a 30-year-old lady and her mom. And then upstairs, there was a young guy who moved in the same week as us. And lastly, a young couple that lived in the room next to the other young guy. In the 3 months that we lived there, the only people we talked to was the young couple upstairs. They seemed similar to us in age and interests, and we just usually talked to them in passing or maybe on the front porch when we were all out there having a cigarette. They were nice enough, and they also smoked weed, which me and my wife did as well. And we smoked on the porch together a couple of times. Things were just a-okay until the month of November came and shit just started to hit the fan, left and right, with this couple who we'll name Jim and Sierra. It started off small. Things like hearing them get into short shouting matches, or one or both of them asking me and my wife to borrow money, or constantly trying to bum cigarettes. One day I came home and Sierra was walking into the house, the same time as me, with 3 guys that I've never seen before, and a case of beer. They party all night and keep me and my wife up, but we end up going to bed around 5 a.m. A few days later, we are woken up on a Sunday. Me and my wife's only day off to Jim screaming at Sierra, throwing all of her stuff into the front yard. He was calling her everything in the book, you can imagine, and told her to get out of his life, yada yada yada. They argued for like 3 hours and eventually someone picked Sierra up. We had a week of peace and quiet, but by the next week she was moved back in, and the fights and screaming were constant. Until one night. It was a Tuesday night, the day before my birthday. Me and my wife worked that day and just kind of lounged around after work. My wife and I ended up smoking some weed around 1 a.m. and we put in a movie to giggle at all night. The whole time we were watching this movie, we could hear Jim and Sierra screaming at each other. We could hear them stomping around as they moved around upstairs in the room right above our ceiling. It went on the whole movie, it seemed like. After actually making it through the movie without falling asleep from smoking too much, we both noticed that Jim and Sierra had finally stopped fighting. We both wanted to take advantage of the quiet, and we laid down and cuddled up to sleep until we had to go to work in the morning. I was woken up in the middle of the night by my wife, who was shaking me and looking off toward my side of the bed. I was so tired and out of it that I thought maybe she saw a big bug and wanted me to kill it. I turn over to get up, and when I do, there is a man standing next to my bed, hunched over my nightstand going through my drawer, and the man has an empty milk gallon in his hand. After rolling over and us locking eyes, he stood up from his hunched position and was just staring at me. I kicked my feet out onto the floor and I sat up on the bed as he started backing up slowly, one step at a time. At this point, I finally realized that it's Jim in our room going through my stuff, holding an empty milk gallon. Now, like I said, I was still pretty out of it and just calmly said to him, "What's up, Jim? Why the hell are you in our room, bud?" After a few seconds, Jim asks, "Can I borrow your guys' car, man? Or can one of you take me down to the gas station and back real quick?" Thank goodness for my wife, who was finally fully awake, unlike me, who said, "What? You broke in our room to borrow our car. No, you cannot borrow our car after you broke into our room at 4 a.m. Now get the hell out of here, you freaking weirdo." Surprisingly, Jim leaves, but he doesn't just leave. He sprints out the front door and starts running down the street, towards the gas station that he asked us to take him to. I looked at my wife, and before we can even say anything to each other, our other neighbor from upstairs comes down and says that Jim and Sierra were fighting worse than he had ever heard, or saw, that he hadn't heard any noise coming from the room for about an hour. My wife, who was feeling protective of a fellow female who had to endure similar abuse in the past, told me and our neighbor to go upstairs and check on her. So we go upstairs and the door to Jim and Sierra's room is shut, but not locked. I knocked and shouted for someone and there was no answer. Standing side by side, me and my neighbor turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. On the back wall of the room, Sierra was laying on the couch, face up, and we also noticed that the floor and ceiling had been hacked up, almost like someone was trying to get inside of the floor and ceiling for some reason. Me and my neighbor walked over to the couch, thinking that Jim had knocked her unconscious, but when we made it to her, we realized there was blood on the couch and thin blood streaks on the wall, and blood all over her. I can't speak for my neighbor, but as soon as I looked at her, I thought, she doesn't have a face. The neighbor called the cops immediately, and I was just standing there dumbfounded. I heard him tell the police that Jim had smashed his girlfriend's face in with a sledgehammer, and the weapon was still there, but Jim had run off. The police told us to leave the room and wait outside if we felt safe doing so. The cops came and they put an APB out on Jim, and they found him about an hour later running down the street. After talking to the cops, they said it looked like Jim was trying to find the gas line in the house, and he probably wanted me to take him to the gas station to get fuel to help him burn down the house with Sierra inside. After all the cops left and everything calmed down, me and my wife looked at each other like, what the hell? We had to call into work the next day because there were 2 news vans out front all morning, and every time we stepped out for a smoke or anything, they were badgering us for an interview. It ended up being a small blip in the news with a short paragraph in the newspaper and a 1-minute segment on the local news channel. But yeah, that's how I was face to face with a murderer, right after he killed his girlfriend in the same house I was in. It was summer of 2004. My family was supposed to vacation to Kennebunkport, Maine. My father was stuck in meetings, so he was going to come up from Manhattan a few days after us. My mom wanted to drive up there to Maine before my dad got there, which was super annoying to me at the time, but we didn't have a choice. And my brother, sister, and I loaded into the car and started the drive. I was about 14 at the time. The drive was uneventful, but there were various delays, and we ended up getting there a lot later than originally planned. Because of this, the owners of the house we were renting had turned in for the night, and we weren't able to get a hold of them to get the keys. Sounds like horrible planning, but apparently they were pretty strict about the time frame to pick up the keys. My mom, unfazed, decided she wanted lobster, so we went to one of our favorite spots. She called my dad to see if he could make us reservations at a hotel in Kennebunkport from New York City while we ate. We were enjoying the lobster while a guy came up and started chatting with my mom. I figured it was just a friendly local making conversation. During this, my dad calls my mom, and my mom excuses herself to speak to him. Apparently, all hotels were booked for the night, go figure. Height of vacation season in Kennebunkport. The plan was for us to drive to the nearest town and just find somewhere to stay until we could pick up the keys for our vacation home. Apparently, the local had been listening into my mom's conversation and came back over when she got off the phone. I want to say there was nothing outwardly off about him. He was preppy looking, clean cut, unassuming, and he fit in with the clientele. He told my mom that he had a big home with a big guest house that we were more than welcome to stay at, and that his wife wouldn't mind. Immediately my reaction was screw that. No way in the world I was staying in a random dude's house in creepy Maine in the dark. No offense to anyone from Maine, but the streets get creepy. My mom, doing her due diligence, determined this guy was legit. Said he was in finance. My mom was an investment banker, and they chatted enough for my mom to determine that he wasn't totally full of it. I called my dad pretty hysterical, but he said I was overreacting and that I needed to get out of the city more and accept that sometimes people are just nice. So my brother, sister, and I got into our car and followed him back to his house. The guest house was actually really nice, fully furnished, but the beds were oddly placed. It had 2 bedrooms, and instead of the beds being located in the middle or centered, imagine a symmetrical room layout. They were right under the window in each room. It just seemed out of place to me. Anyway, fast forward, we are all getting ready to go to bed. My mom hears a knock on the door, and it's the guy. He said he just wanted to check to make sure we got settled. Cool. Nice thing to do. About 30 minutes later, he comes back to check in again. At this point, my mom was like, thanks, we're good. We'll stop by the house in the morning to say thank you, etc. Okay, so fast forward another 30 or 45 minutes. I can't sleep. I'm feeling terrified. We hear this rustling, which is odd, because the guest house was nowhere around trees, or even close proximity to bushes that might cause such a noise. At this point, I see my mom wide awake and look up at the window, like motioning towards the window with her eyes. Let me add real quick, none of the windows had curtains. The guy said it was because his wife was in the process of redecorating. When I looked up, there was a male figure just standing. I thought I was going to have a heart attack. I don't know how long he was there for. When he walked away, my mom waited a bit and then told us to get our stuff together. She wasn't messing around. We had my dad on the phone at this point, and he was pretty much flipping out at my mom about something, but I didn't hear what. My mom said she was going to put stuff in the car and to follow her out. This was around 2 a.m. When we got into the car, we pulled around to the front of the main house so we could get the hell out of there. However, when we got to the front, all the lights were off. Not just all the lights, but it looked like no one had been home. Porch light, table lamp, and front windows, like everything black. Also, the 2 cars were gone. The local's car and what we presumed to be his wife's car. After seeing this, my mom at this point, pretty unsettled, said we were leaving and we proceeded to drive to the gate. The gate at the end of the driveway had been deadbolted and padlocked shut from the inside. It wasn't a super strong gate, so my dad said rev it, and we were in a big SUV. We just smashed right through it. We drove back straight to New York City, not speaking the entire time. We have never returned back to Maine, and my parents refused to speak about it. I asked a family member one night about it when he was drunk, and all he said was, "They didn't tell you?" The actual owners of that house were on vacation. I'm assuming my mom or dad followed up with local authorities and figured that out, but never told us. I don't know who that man was or what was planned that evening. I was curious as to whether there were any known serial killers or murderers who were in that area at that time. This encounter happened in the summer of 2006 when I was 20 years old. I didn't get my driver's license until January of that year, and driving opened up so many doors for me that I took a lot of solo road trips to my friends' houses. I also looked pretty young for my age, and I was often mistaken for a high school student in my early 20s. I was driving alone on I-78 on a random July day, on my way to visit my friend in southern Pennsylvania for a long weekend. Her parents were away, and we had the house to ourselves, and we were planning on drinking and hot tubbing and watching Planet Earth drunk. It had just came out. Maybe run around some cornfields at night. I was so excited, and I had a great drive, listening to good music, and it was a beautiful day for driving. Right after I crossed the border from New Jersey into Pennsylvania, I stopped at one of the first rest stops to get gas and snacks for the last part of my drive. I've tried to figure out which rest stop this was, and I can't ID it, but it was a gas station with a large mini-mart. Opposite of the gas station was the on-ramp back to I-78 West, and parallel to the on-ramp was a dirt road which comes into play later. I was heading into the store when a man in his late 30s or early 40s approached me. He was a stocky guy, decently tall. I'm 5'1". He had on a plain black tee and jeans with dark brown hair and a mustache and goatee. He had just come out of a black pickup truck parked a few spaces away from my car. He had a super intense gaze and immediately creeped me out. He just had a crazy energy about him. I don't really get bad vibes from people that often, but this was just strange. He stood too close, with his gaze crazy and direct and focused. His word choice was strange. He immediately set off all of my alarms. He asked if I was from the area, despite my Connecticut license plate. He even asked where I was headed and if I knew of anything fun to do, because he had plans later and time to kill beforehand. He invited me to go play mini golf or watch a movie with him. I truthfully didn't answer any of his questions, and I declined his invitation to hang out with him, and I told him that I didn't know the area that well, and I walked away towards the store. I was blown away that he asked me to go somewhere with him. It was so random and uncomfortable. As I was walking away, he actually screamed out, "You're gorgeous." And the volume and tone made my hair stand on end. It was super aggressive and inappropriate, and he even startled a family that was walking out of the store. It was that loud. He came into the store shortly after, and he was just staring at me, so I went to use the bathroom, and I stayed in there for at least 10 minutes, texting my friend about this creep. When I came out, he wasn't in the store anymore, thankfully, so I took my time buying drinks and snacks. Sour Bright crawlers and trail mix being my obligatory road trip food, and I went out to gas up my car. I was relieved his car was gone, and I started thinking about the rest of my drive and getting excited to see my friend. When I pull up to the road to get back on the highway though, I hear someone persistently honking his horn, and I see this creep show on the dirt road parallel to the on-ramp in his truck honking and shouting and waving at me to drive over to him. He was directly facing the gas station and had been waiting for me to pull up. I immediately freaked out and jumped on the on-ramp back to I-78. He pulled onto the highway after me, and I called my friend extremely scared. I drove so fast and probably dangerously, and looking back, I'm lucky that I didn't get into an accident, but I just didn't know what to do. He didn't follow me for that long, and I think after a few exits he finally pulled off. My friend and I had a backup plan that if I saw his car again, she would direct me to a police station the next town over from her house, instead of me going directly there and leading some freak to us. I didn't see the car again and went to my friend's, but the last hours of my drive I was extremely tense and anxious. I remember checking my mirrors often for this black pickup truck. It all ended well. I got to my friend's house safely and we had a nice weekend. The encounter was definitely creepy, but over the years I didn't put much thought into it. A few years ago though, in 2014, I was talking with another friend who is big into serial killers, and I mentioned my encounter jokingly, suggesting that this was a serial killer I had met, and told her my experience. She was fascinated and she wanted to Google active serial killers in Pennsylvania area at the time. The first hit was for Adam Leroy Lane, and he looked almost exactly like the man I met back in 2006. It could have been my mind filling in the blanks, but the basic characteristics, 40s, tall but stocky, brown hair with mustache and goatee, and the time and area all match. In my memory, he was a little bit slimmer than the pictures, and it was 2006, not 2007, when he was actually convicted of murdering women. Still, it's an odd coincidence, and one I've never forgotten.
I recently remembered this. It's one of those memories that isn't extremely terrifying enough to remember, but it's eerie enough to stay in your mind for a good while. I'd say I was about 13 years old when this happened. At the time, I lived in a small town, and this girl a few years younger than me had gone missing. The situation was really distressing. They discovered her lifeless body, and it seemed she had undergone torture prior to her passing. It was a huge deal, and obviously, it made parents paranoid about who they let be around their children. So, back to my experience. My mom took me to a Burger King close to our apartment. We would go there on the days when she was too exhausted from work and lacked the energy to cook. On this particular day, she went to place the order while I settled into a booth, idly toying with the paper for my straw. And that's when a man entered and approached me. It was as if when he entered the establishment, his eyes were scanning around until they fixed on me, and then he made his way over to where I was seated. I can't say for certain, but I don't believe he was homeless. Perhaps he was? He had this odd smell to him, and his clothes were ripped and dirty. He kept his hands buried in his jeans pocket and kept moving them around and swaying back and forth while standing and looking down at me with that unsettling smile he kept smiling. He started talking to me, and I remember that he had that kind of voice that makes you feel gross. He just kept staring at me, and while staring, he randomly started talking about the girl who went missing and was later found dead. It wasn't like a casual topic to talk about, especially with a 13-year-old girl. This started to creep me out even more, and on top of that, there was a certain gleam in his eyes that suggested he found the whole thing exciting, both the event itself and discussing it with a young girl. He went into detail about how he had heard that the circumstances surrounding the girl's situation were related to matters of sexual nature. Now, when you're very young and a strange and unsettling man who appears to not have showered in probably weeks is discussing sexual topics with you and he's using such intense language and emphasis with his words, it's just really unnerving. The entire situation is messed up. I felt uneasy as this guy was standing extremely close to me, practically blocking my side of the booth. It was as if he was aware that unless he stood almost pressed against my side, I would promptly get up and abandon this so-called charming conversation. Luckily, before he could talk more about sex or ask if I've done it before, which is where he was going, my mom saw him. She came over and asked him loudly what he wanted and why he was talking to me. He looked surprised, stepped back really quickly, and left. Some workers rushed out after him to check who he was and what he looked like because they didn't know whether to call the cops or just make sure he never came again. I was really shaken up, and my mom was freaked out too. She said she was gonna buy me mace and stuff to stay safe after that. After that happened, I was always worried I'd run into him again. Small town life, you know? A few times I thought I saw him riding a bike when I'd be in the car with my mom. Another time, I think I saw him in a store we were in, but I was young and scared, so I'm not too sure if it was really him.
I was out camping in a familiar part of the forest near my city. My city is small and honestly has not much to do, so camping is the one thing I found that I really enjoyed doing. I'm not a big fan on hiking though. I prefer the more relaxing aspects of camping, like sitting by a fire and having no responsibilities. The trail I went on was one I'd been to plenty of times. It was only a 30-ish minute walk from the parking area, and the campsite was right by a lake. Having only my small city near the forest, there's only so many people that could possibly be camping at the same time and place as I was. But this time when I got there, a man had a tent already set up. I could see him down by the lake, walking in the sand. He looked like he was in his 40s. He had some generic swimming shorts on and a stained white t-shirt. I walked a little further from where his tent was, then set up mine. I then collected some large stones from nearby and placed them in a ring, prepping for the campfire I was going to have later. As I did, I noticed the man looking at me. Not just like a glance though. He was standing down by the lake with his body turned completely toward me and was watching me. I tried to ignore it, but every time I looked back, he was in that same spot and still staring at me. It got really creepy, so I ended up waving at him to see if he was maybe wanting to say hi or something. But after I waved, he turned around and continued walking along the lake. Whatever that was, I didn't like it. It gave me an uncomfortable feeling about that guy, so I tried to keep an eye on him. For a while, nothing else really happened, but after 20 minutes, he walked away from the lake and into the forest behind his tent. I thought there might have been a trail back there, or he could have just been walking around, but whatever the case, I was just glad he was gone for now. I put my chair down by the lake and relaxed. I was down there for an hour or so before picking my chair back up and moving it back to my tent. The sun was setting, so I lit up my campfire. As I sat there and looked around at the forest, I suddenly spotted something. Far out, there was a shape next to one of the trees. I squinted, trying to get a clearer view. All I could make out was what looked like a white shirt. It was that guy again, and he was just standing far behind my campsite and staring in my direction. Now this was getting really creepy. How long was he watching me for? I moved my chair to the other side of the campfire so that I was now facing him, just so I didn't lose sight of him. He stayed there for a good 30 or 40 minutes, watching me from far out in the forest, before it started to get dark out. The shadows everywhere started making it hard to see him anymore, and after a while, I couldn't even make out his shape. I could only look in the general direction he was in. Yet with my campfire lighting up my sight, I knew he could still see me. Knowing he was still out there staring at me, yet not being able to see anything, I started getting really anxious. I mean, what the hell was this guy doing? He had a tent here, like he was camping, but in the hours that I'd been here, I never once saw him go to it. With everything getting to my head, I debated packing up and leaving, but at this point, I was worried the guy would follow me out. So, I sat there and tended the fire, making sure it didn't go out, and I just waited. Several long, tiring hours passed, and I didn't see anything. He never came back to his tent, or came close enough for me to see him. When the sun started coming up, I looked all around and saw no signs of him. I packed up my gear and booked it back to my car. It's hard to know that guy's intentions. If I hadn't stayed awake and been cautious of him from the start, who knows where I'd be right now. I go camping with my dad every summer. He's done it his whole life, and recently I've gotten into it as well. I'm 16, and last year my dad and I went out on our seasonal camping trip. We found the spot online together while looking for a new camping area to try out for the summer. There's no pictures of the area, but the map was easy to follow, and the description of the trail was that it was easy and uncrowded. We set out on Friday morning, parking on the side of the road and beginning down the trail. After the first quarter mile, it was clear that the description wasn't very accurate. It was pretty steep in some parts, and a lot of the trail was muddy or overgrown, which made it actually really hard. Already being there though, we just pushed through and eventually got to the campsite. It looked no different than the woods on the trail that we had been walking on for the past 2 hours. There were trees everywhere, and just a plot of overgrown grass to set our stuff up on. No cool views or anything. We pitched our tents and made lunch. My dad was a bit of a talker, so the rest of the day we were just in conversation. Once the sun was starting to set, we walked around the trees near the campsite and collected some dry sticks to make a fire with. In the middle of us talking though, we were interrupted by a loud voice behind us. We both stopped talking and spun around. The woods were suddenly quiet again, and we didn't see anyone there. It sounded not too far away though, like maybe a mile out. Neither of us said anything for 30 seconds, just staring at the trees and trying to spot any movement. Then it came again. Someone, a man's voice, yelling. It sent chills through me. There was a pain and harshness to the scream, like they were in trouble. I looked up at my dad, who looked really conflicted and worried. He turned me around and led me back to the campsite, quickly starting the fire. The screams kept coming though, and eventually I asked my dad if we should help them. I could tell my dad was thinking of every option. He faced me and told me to stay by the fire and wait. His face was serious, and he said he was going to run a little ways toward the voice and just see what he could see, and that if I saw anyone, to not let them near me. I agreed and watched him run toward the man's voice. After a minute, he was out of sight. Honestly, I wasn't sure what I would have done if I were in my dad's shoes. Leaving someone in need of serious help would make me feel horrible, but we were also in the middle of the woods, so if something happens, well, I don't know. After 10 minutes, I started to get a little worried. The sun felt like it was dropping fast, and there was still no sign of my dad. But then, suddenly, the screaming stopped. The whole forest was now quiet again. I wondered if my dad had found him and was helping him, or if something else happened. Still, after another 10 minutes, my dad was nowhere in sight. With the blanket of darkness starting to cover the forest, I grew more and more nervous. I stood up and walked a little bit away from the campsite and toward where my dad had gone. There were still no signs of him, so I walked a little more, and then, finally, I heard footsteps from up ahead. I still couldn't see anything, but as the sound of his steps started getting closer and closer, an eerie, almost disturbing feeling came over me. Then, just before I thought they would come into my sight, a voice to my left called my name. It was my dad running toward me and yelling at me to go back. There was urgency and worry in his voice, so I hurried to the campsite and my dad followed behind me. He quickly packed the essentials into his backpack. The look on my dad's face is something I still remember vividly. It was complete fear and distraught. We left the tents and ran for the first mile. then fast-walked back to our car. On the drive home, I asked him what he saw out there, who the man was, and why he was screaming. My dad said nothing. Even to this day, he never brings it up or says anything of what he saw. Every time I so much as mention that day, his entire demeanor changes and his face falls flat. So I just stopped asking. All I can think about now is those footsteps that I heard walking toward me, and what would have happened if my dad hadn't shown up in time. I was with my 2 college friends doing a weekend camping trip in the woods near us. I'll use different names for their privacy, so I'll call them Ryan and Jamie. Ryan and I aren't experienced in outdoor activities, so it was Jamie leading us through it all. He had a small spot by the river that he led us to. It was a couple miles through the woods, but there was a huge field just on the edge of the river that we would set up camp at. When we got there, nobody else was there. We set everything up right in the middle of the field, between the woods and the river, then brought out the beers and sat around a campfire. A little while after getting there, I happened to see some people out by the tree line. They looked like hunters, having dirty clothes and backpacks, like they were blending into the woods, but I didn't see any rifles. They were pretty far though, so maybe I just couldn't see them. I pointed them out to my friends, but Jamie had a puzzled look. He said hunting in these woods was illegal, and it wasn't even hunting season anyway. He seemed really concerned that they were out here. Ryan joked that he was taking it too seriously, and we went back to our random conversations. A few more hours later, we agreed to call it a night. The sun had been down for a while at this point, and the hike had really worn us out. We all went into our tents, but not being used to it, I found it really hard to fall asleep. Something about being out in the open in a tiny tent and laying on a thin blow-up mattress just had me feeling off. I must have laid there for a whole 2 hours, and at that point, I was just hoping I could at least get a few hours of sleep. But then something instantly made me wide awake. Footsteps coming toward our tents. At first I thought it had to be Ryan or Jamie, probably coming back from using the bathroom, but I swear I would have heard them unzipping their tent and walking out. Only a few seconds later though, I realized there were more than just one set of footsteps. There were 2 or 3, maybe even more, all walking in a line. I looked at the thin wall of my tent, thinking I should be able to see their lights coming toward us, but there weren't any lights at all. Surely whoever was out there had to have seen our tents set up in the middle of an open field, and nobody in their right mind would just walk past us like this. I didn't know what to do though. I just pretended to be asleep, quietly listening to them getting closer. The line of people came probably just a few feet from us, walking right past our tents. As soon as they were far enough away, I quietly unzipped my tent and looked out. Just when I did, Ryan unzipped his tent too. We both looked at each other with alarmed faces, then looked out at the group. They were barely visible, but definitely still walking away. I slipped out of my tent and opened Jamie's, waking him up. Both of us explained what happened, and surprisingly, he seemed even more horrified than either of us, likely because he'd been camping plenty of times and knew how odd this was. We started packing up our stuff, feeling way too uneasy to stay the rest of the night. While packing, Jamie suddenly told us with a shaky voice to hurry. We looked up at him, then followed his gaze. In the tree line, the group of what now looks like 5 or 6 people were standing and looking over at us. My adrenaline was pumping now, and I shoved everything into my bag, and we all sprinted for the trail. We left our lights off to hopefully not be seen, so the rest of the walk we were barely able to see anything. Luckily we made it back, but what that group is doing out there is unknown. Based on everything though, I don't think our encounter with them was any sort of accident.
I used to work at Subway years back. The job was exactly what you would expect, and I liked it. I remember that something really creepy happened one time though. I still randomly think about it here and there. One time I was working a closing shift. I think we closed at like 9 p.m. or something like that, and I had been working since sometime in the afternoon. Our Subway location was in a good spot and would get really busy during certain times. At around 5 p.m. it started to get busy, and by 6 there were lots of people in line. I remember that I was kept very busy during this time and was making sandwiches. On this night, I believe that we had 3 of us working, and then 2 of us would be there until the close. So we had 2 people making the subs and 1 person on the register at this particular moment. Still, even with this, the line was kept somewhat long for quite a while. I remember that the restaurant was overall crowded, but I looked up and I noticed this guy in line that was just staring at me. It wasn't like he was just looking at me or in my direction, but intensely staring at me. I did not recognize the guy, and I didn't look at him for very long before looking away. Then I focused back on what I was doing. Sometime later, maybe like 5 minutes, I looked up again randomly, and I noticed the guy still staring. I looked away again and was not looking forward to when it would be his turn in line. However, like 10 minutes at least went by, and I didn't have to make a sandwich for the guy. After a while, I looked around, and I noticed that he was not in line anymore. But unfortunately, he was still inside of the restaurant, and he was still staring at me. I just looked away again and went back to work. We were all so busy that I didn't have time to point him out to a coworker or anything. I barely had time to wonder why this guy was staring at me. I just knew that I didn't know who he was or why he was looking at me. Finally, a while later, things quieted down a little bit. I realized the man was still there, and I decided to take my break. So I went into the back for a while, and when I came back out to work, the man was gone. I thought that was the end of it. At that point, I only had a couple of hours of work left. Things were very quiet for the rest of the night. There were a few customers here and there, but not many. It was just me and another coworker that were there until close. At probably like 20 or 30 minutes before closing time, I remember that the guy was back, but this time, he was outside of the restaurant. There are big windows at the front of the Subway, and the guy was staring right inside. When I noticed him, I got so creeped out. During this time, I was alone behind the counter, and my coworker was in the back. The man outside was just staring at me like before, and this was several hours after he had last been there. I was so creeped out by this that I went into the back to get my coworker. When we both came out, the man was gone. We closed up a short time later without getting any more customers. Then when we left, I looked around the parking lot for the guy in case he was staring at me someplace else, but he wasn't. I didn't notice him, and we left after that. I was a part-time employee, so I did not work every day, and I remember I don't think I worked for the next few days after that. When I returned to work, I did not see the guy again. I still don't know who he was or what he was doing.
I'm keeping some of these details vague because I seriously don't want the host to find out that I published this story. I don't think they would approve. I hope that is alright, and I'll try to make it as comprehensive as possible. I spent a year studying in Mexico recently, and as you do on exchange, I tried to travel as much as I could. Between the semesters, there was a big break, and me and my buddy that I spent the most time with during the exchange decided that we'd go on a longer backpacking trip to Mexico together. We had a rough plan on where to go and what we wanted to see, but we hadn't even booked our flight back yet, nor were we sure from where we would take it from. We wanted to keep it flexible. We had an amazing time, and a few days before our trip ended, we finally decided we would take our flight from a city that was close and had really cheap flights, but the city itself didn't really have anything to offer. Then on Airbnb, we found a room very close to the airport in a house with a pool. and we thought we'd just treat ourselves to a relaxed pool day at the end of the trip. It turned out that the hosts were a family. The husband was Mexican and the wife was from Europe, could even speak our native language. So we arranged that we would take a bus to the airport and that they would pick us up from there. When we finally arrived to the city, it was already dark, and the bus driver refused to drive us to the airport since it was not directly on his route, so he just dropped us off on the highway. That was already a pretty shitty situation to begin with, standing with our backpacks at the side of the road in the middle of nowhere in a not-so-safe city in Mexico. But I called the host and sent them our GPS location, and they say no problem and that they will come get us. So the husband came to pick us up, and it was a very uncomfortable situation getting into the car with a stranger in the night, in the middle of nowhere. It also didn't help that the guy looked like Danny Trejo without a mustache, and as I tried to make small talk with him, he only gave monosyllabic answers or straight out ignored me. Well, he's just not a big talker, I thought, and I hoped we would arrive soon. Looking back, I can see a million red flags, but for some reason at that time, we just didn't see them. Either we were too tired, or to be honest, we didn't really have any other choice than going along anyway, so. But yes, we arrive, and that should have immediately set alarms off. We were in the middle of nowhere. There were fields with sheep and goats around, and all of a sudden, a gravel road branches off from the paved road, and along that gravel road, there are about 6 huge mansions. All with 2-meter walls around them, topped with NATO fence huge gates and at least 2 gigantic guard dogs per house. When we entered their house, we were greeted by the wife, a bubbly middle-aged woman that was very talkative but pleasant. She had actually cooked dinner for us, and we ate while exchanging small talk. The husband just sat at the table not saying a single word. After dinner, we more or less went directly to bed because it had gotten late, and we were tired from a long day. The next morning, we saw that the weather was not that good, so we decided to go into town and just see a few touristy things it had to offer, instead of spending it at the pool. When we came back, it was already dark, but we decided to jump into the pool anyways to cool off, because it was really hot and humid. The wife joined us, and at some point, my friend made the mistake to ask how they were able to afford such a house. It didn't really match the price range of the jobs they were telling us that they were doing. And she deflected a bit and added that her husband was very handy because he had grown up in the streets and basically built a house himself. We realized that it was maybe not the best topic, and we broke the conversation off. That was the last day of our trip, and we had our flight back home early in the morning. We still had some weed left that we had brought on the trip, and we thought it would be nice to smoke one, since it was our last night. But as this was a family home and they had kids around, we thought it would be better to speak to our hosts if they would mind. So later in the evening, we asked the wife if it would be okay if we smoked on the property, which for some reason she found quite amusing and started laughing. She shouted to her husband, who was lying on the couch watching TV, "My love, the boys asked if it would be okay if they smoked some weed. What do you think?" And he just laughed but didn't give an answer. He looked at her with a dumbfounded expression as she told us sure, just go ahead. So we went to the terrace and started smoking our joint. Later, they joined us and we just had a chat. And this is where things got really fucked up. For some reason, they started asking all sorts of questions about the weed. Where we got it, how much it was, who we got it from, and how much we would have to pay for that back in Europe. They just seemed way too interested in the weed, and at one point, the wife just nonchalantly revealed to us, yes, we thought about doing that as a source of income, selling weed, but too many people die doing that, because the cartels don't like that. Actually, my husband used to kill people for doing that. I immediately felt sober. Did she just say? And as if he read my mind, her husband added, yes, when I was about 16, I killed a lot of people for the cartel for money. And he said it in a tone as if he had just used to mow lawns when he was a teenager. I still thought I must have misunderstood, so I texted my friend who was sitting across the table from me, trying not to make eye contact, because I knew we would freak each other out. He confirmed that I had indeed understood right. We discussed what we should do and agreed that there's no immediate threat and that we should just stay. We don't have anywhere else to go anyways, and it's already late. But things got even crazier. We tried to keep our composure and not completely freak out while still making conversation with our hosts. A few minutes later, though, the husband got up and went inside to get something. And he came back with a literal kilo of weed, pressed into a brick. He proceeded to break bits off the brick and roll them into a joint that would probably have knocked out Snoop Dogg. It was about the size of my thumb, and I guess it had about 2 grams of weed in there. Of course, he offered the joint to us, but we politely declined, saying that we were already pretty stoned. He seemed a little offended, but fortunately, he bought our excuse. But it got even worse. A few minutes later, we hear a couple of loud bangs. The wife became a bit uneasy and asked, "What was that?" To which he answered calmly, 9mm. To confirm my suspicion, that had indeed been shots. I would say it was around 7 or something shots, fired pretty quickly after each other. The wife got nervous and asked if we should maybe go inside. "What do you think they are shooting at in the air? At cows? At people?" But he just shrugged it off and we stayed outside. Again, a few minutes later, there were more shots, but this time even closer. The wife got even more upset and asked again, "Should we go inside? What do you think they are shooting at? We need to go inside." And I think I'll never forget when he answered in the calmest way imaginable, "No, everything's okay. I didn't hear any screams yet." I don't know why, but the way he just calmly said that freaked me out, and it is still making my heart beat whenever I think about it. After that, we quickly excused ourselves and went to our room. When we could finally talk, we basically both lost it and panicked. What the hell were we supposed to do? We are locked in a house with a contract killer in the middle of absolutely nowhere. People are shooting outside. We decided it was probably our best bet to stay because we thought, well, we are his guests and he is not going to harm us. And it's better to have walls and dogs and a serial killer in between us and people shooting around. So we barricaded ourselves into the room and didn't sleep a second until the morning, when we noped the hell out of there and went to the airport. I was never so happy to be patted down as security my whole life. Growing up, I lived with my emotionally and mentally abusive helicopter mom, and misogynistic stepdad, and my brother. When I turned 18, my grandparents were kind enough to let me move in with them since they lived so close to my college. This was my way out, away from that clown show at home, and I was incredibly grateful for them. I sometimes wonder if my parents hadn't been so hard on me, if this would have ever even happened. But I was an adult and I made these decisions. Luckily, I learned from them. Once I was free, so to speak, and had much more freedom, I naturally started to rebel a bit more while I was trying to find my way. I rebelled in everything from clothing, music, tattoos, and even dating. Specifically, I wanted to date the most out there person to prove a point, I guess. If I could go back to my 18-year-old self, I would punch myself in the face for these decisions. I was on a local MySpace forum and I saw James. I went to high school with James and we got on fine, but I hadn't seen him in a couple of years. It turns out that James had suffered some childhood trauma and went to go live with a relative about 8 hours away in another state, and was seemingly living a more stable life now. We started messaging back and forth, and I liked James a lot. He was different, quirky, and edgy even. I started to speak with James more and more frequently, and messages became texts, and somehow in the mix, it became a relationship that I regret to this day. Every day, non-stop texting, and sometimes it would turn dark, and James would say things to me that are forever ingrained in my head. He would often talk about his childhood trauma and some seriously disturbing things. Of course, this is a red flag, and I'm unsure why I continue to stick around. After a couple of months, James came to visit me. We stayed a few days in a hotel, and it seemed like a whirlwind. I truly cared about him, but looking back, I don't know if I would have necessarily called it love, or simply just having a good time. But at the time, I was convinced that it was love, and that I felt like he was the one for me. There was an instance where I had come out of the bathroom at the hotel, and I remember the hotel room being in disarray, clothes strewn everywhere, and it was just a giant mess. But James stood there smiling. He got down on one knee and proposed with a small sapphire and diamond ring. I said yes, but it just didn't feel real, or something about it was unsettling. When I think about it, I feel nauseous. I guess it's a bit of an embarrassment that still lingers. Towards the end of James' visit, we sobbed together and we were unsure of how we were going to make this work. What other options did I have other than to move? I withdrew from my classes and moved to his area. I remember when I told my parents, my mom was extremely upset that I never discussed this with her or my stepdad. I think that conversation fueled me to really stick it out and make it work. In my mind, I was an adult and this was a huge adult decision, and I didn't need to discuss anything with anyone, and no one would tell me anything different. We lived in a small room at James' grandmother's house, and we never really left. He would act very strange when I mentioned wanting friends or wanting to get a job so I could leave the house, or even wanting to leave the house in general. I mentioned earlier in the past that James had his quirks and would sometimes do odd things. For example, he had become a huge Insane Clown Posse fan during our relationship. I knew that he liked them, but not to the extent of borderline obsession. They weren't my cup of tea, but I'm not going to tell someone what they can and can't listen to. But things just got weird. James had become such a fan that he got a giant tattoo that represented his love for the Insane Clown Posse. He started to solely listen to their music, and he started to paint his face, often in clown makeup. It became so much of an obsession that he would try to force me to paint my face, and would get irrationally upset and would scream at me. He shoved me and tried to trap me into a closet when I told him that I just didn't want to. It was something that really set him off, and I'm unsure why. As the days went by, I started to feel more and more isolated to just staying in our room in this house, and I could only really ever leave the bedroom to eat or use the bathroom. Otherwise, we just stayed in the room. When I did get to leave the house, James had to be with me and we would just go to his other relative's house or to dinner. I had no friends and I wasn't allowed to get a job and I had no support system. James kept a notebook that he would journal in and would openly read some of his entries that seemed pretty mild. I shouldn't have invaded his privacy on that particular day, but I think it saved my life. James was getting ready for work and had his notebook on the bed. He had been acting strange and cold towards me, so I looked into the journal. Some of his entries mentioned how he wanted to cut me on my privates with a box cutter, and he tiptoed around the idea of me not being alive, and this was my out. My parents and I were somewhat speaking at this time, and my aunt lived a couple of hours from me. I had told everyone that I was coming home and what I had just read. My aunt packed up and started heading my way, just in case and to make sure I could safely leave. I told James that I saw what he wrote and that I was going to go back home, and that this relationship isn't going to work out. James fell to his knees in tears, begging me not to leave, saying that he loved me, but that all quickly changed into anger when he wanted to lock me in his closet so I couldn't leave. Lucky for me, he had to go to work before he could really do anything. While he was gone, I packed up my things while listening to his grandma scream at me and I left. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end here. A few months had gone by and James and I had become friends and I had come to visit him, which was the last visit. Nothing bad happened. It wasn't even a bad time or anything, but I just knew that I had to cut him out. Years had gone by after that visit, I would say maybe 3 or 4, and I had heard through mutual friends that James had gotten married. I had moved across the country for school and should just explore a new area and have the freedom that I should have gotten on the first go without being so crazy. James would occasionally try to speak with me on social media and I would just not reply, or the replies would be a few and far in between. I'm 32 now and I recently got married. I've started to settle down and my husband and I are trying for our first baby, which is very exciting. James hasn't been a thought in my mind over the past several years at this point, until recently. He found me on Facebook, and to be honest, I didn't think he had social media anymore. At this point, I expressed to him that we are not friends and it's really inappropriate to keep messaging me. I said, "Can you please stop?" And he replied, "No." Fair enough, so I blocked him. Another few months go by and I get a Snapchat from him. Blocked. Another few months go by and he followed me on Instagram. I kept my Instagram open because I like to post about my travels and fitness stuff and I really have nothing to hide, or anything to really be private about, until he started following me. I went to block his account and I noticed that this was a brand new account. No followers and he only followed me. I have since made everything private, blocked all accounts, went to those sites like Been Verified, and had all of my information removed from those databases. I feel like I made a grave mistake as a teenager and I was able to move on from that, and wanting to live a normal life. I'm unsure why he still lurks around trying to antagonize me and be involved in my life.
This happened back when I was a kid. I was pretty young, I think about 7 years old or so. I remember that when I was a kid, I always loved going to Toys R Us. My parents didn't really go there too much, but whenever they did, I was sure to go along. I have a younger sister, and during this time, she would have been about 3 or 4 years old. One time, I went with my mom and sister to the local Toys R Us. I don't remember the exact reason why we were there. I don't think that I was supposed to be getting anything though. Still, I was glad to go with and look at all the toys. It was really the only toy store that I remember going to as a kid. So we got there, and I was walking around following my mom and sister and looking at everything. Most of the time we would go to a store, there would be 1 or 2 aisles of toys, and here it was the entire place. The store really was not that busy. I don't remember exactly what day of the week we went on or what time it was, but I do remember there being not that many other people around. So after following my mom and sister for a while, I found this area of toys that I was really interested in. My mom knew that I liked it, and she was going to go to another part of the store with my sister. I remember she asked me if I wanted to stay in that area or come with her, and obviously I chose to stay, because I think she was going to one of the girl aisles for my sister. She then told me where she would be and said she would come back to get me. Then her and my sister left. I stayed where I was, and nobody else was in the immediate area. After a while though, I wanted to go back to my mom. I don't remember exactly why, but I did. I should have just stayed where I was and waited for her to come back, but I was young, so I remember that I left the area to go and find my mom. I figured that it would be really easy. Unfortunately for me, it was not. I got lost pretty quickly and didn't really know where in the store I was. Then I started to get worried that I would not be able to find my mom at all. After walking around for a short time, this nice woman approached me. I'm not really sure how long she saw me wandering around, but she came up to me and asked if I was okay. She was very friendly, and she asked me if I was looking for my mom, and I told her yes. She told me that she had seen my mom and knew where she was. I don't know why, but I completely believed her. So the woman told me to follow her, and I started walking next to her. We went down a few random aisles. I remember the next thing I knew, we were near the front of the store and the entrance. It appeared as though this woman was just going to walk right out the doors with me. As we got closer, I remember seeing this man just standing by the doors. He was alone, and I remember he looked at me and also looked at the woman. We were walking closer and closer to him. Now, I knew that my mom hadn't left. She definitely would have come and found me before, and certainly wouldn't have gone outside without me. I remember telling the woman that my mom was at the girls' aisle, but the woman just completely ignored me. I had to have told her that like 2 or 3 times in a row. She did not stop walking and did not say anything. So when we got within like 30 feet of the door, I just stopped. I then turned around and just ran in the other direction. The woman did not run after me. I went as far into the store as I could, and as I continued to walk around, I remember finally noticing all the pink from the girls' aisles. So I went over there, and I actually found my mom. I remember that after that, I did not see the woman or the man inside the store, and they must have left. I also did not go far away from my mom for the rest of the time we were there. I'm a female, and this took place one night about 20 years ago. At this time, my daughter was just 5 years old. One night, I left home to do some shopping. I was getting groceries and then was going to get my daughter a birthday present. She would be turning 6 in a few days. She stayed at home with my husband and I went by myself. So I got to the Toys R Us and it was sometime at night. I don't remember exactly when, but after going inside, things were very quiet and I think that they must have been closing soon. I knew one thing that I wanted to get for my daughter, but I was kind of looking around for something else as well. I don't even remember what toys they were. Probably some kind of stuffed animals or something else related to animals. After being there a little while, as I was standing in this one aisle by myself, I looked over and noticed this guy at the end of the aisle. It was a man who was wearing a large black coat and also wearing a hat. He was just kind of standing there and seemingly looking at me. Immediately, it struck me as suspicious. I'm not a paranoid person at all, but this just seemed really odd. I didn't really look at him and pretended not to notice, but I could see out of the corner of my eye him still just kind of standing there. After a little while, I looked over again. A few seconds after looking at him, he walked away. I didn't know what that was all about, so I moved on and was shopping for probably about 15 more minutes. I didn't see the man during this time. I then checked out and left the store. The parking lot was dark and quiet, and I made my way to my vehicle. But it didn't take me long to notice that there was a car parked right next to mine. It was an SUV, I believe a Suburban, and it was dark gray in color. Maybe it was because of the man staring at me in the store, but this also gave me a bad feeling. It seemed to be parked unnecessarily close to my car, especially with so many open spaces around. But I kept walking towards my vehicle. I then heard one of the SUV doors open, and sort of saw it, but it was at the side farthest away from me. I thought about stopping, but I told myself to just keep going and ignore it. However, shortly after this, I noticed a man walk around the SUV, and it was the same guy who I had seen inside. This was enough for me to turn around instantly where I was and walk back towards the store. I went all the way back inside of the Toys R Us. Unfortunately, not long after making it inside, I saw the man enter the store as well. I wasn't really sure what to do. The guy seemed to be following me, and I didn't know why. His car was parked right next to mine for some strange reason as well. I walked into the store and went down a random aisle. When I did, I saw the man walking a ways away, but in my direction. I just started walking through random aisles of the store. The man was not right behind me or anything. Occasionally, I would look back and see him off in the distance. I'm not sure if he was trying to make it seem like he wasn't following me, but I could tell. I decided to call my husband. I took out my cell phone and called our home phone. Thankfully, he was quick to answer. When I told him what was going on, he said he would be on his way. We luckily lived pretty close by, and it was easily under 10 minutes. I continued to walk around the store. To delay time even more, I picked out another random toy for our daughter. Then I went to buy that as well. When I went to check out, I saw the man get in line right behind me. I'm not sure what he was getting, if anything, but when I left the checkout area, I decided to leave the store again. This time, I saw my husband's car was parked right across from mine and the SUV. I also noticed that the man was following me again, and I heard his footsteps approaching from behind. When I started walking outside, the man left the store as well. My husband emerged from his vehicle and also started approaching me. At that time, the man behind me actually changed directions. He went to the left, almost to the next row of parking spaces, but then quickly almost ran to his SUV, got inside of it, and left. After that, we both went home. I'm grateful that my husband was able to help me out. That man was much larger than I was, and I did not carry any pepper spray at the time. After that, I started to, but luckily, nothing like that has happened since. Way back when I was like 17, I think, I worked at a Toys R Us store. This was back when they were pretty popular and not going out of business yet. It was a typical store, and I had gotten the job because my mom's friend was the manager. When I worked there, it was pretty nice. We usually weren't that busy unless it was a weekend, and I mostly just worked as a cashier. But one time when I was working, something really creepy happened. It was early in my shift, and things were pretty quiet. I was the only cashier that was open at the time, and I think we had 2 other people working. I'm not sure exactly where they were, probably in the back organizing things or stocking a shelf. Things would often be very quiet earlier in the day, but then would get busy in the afternoon. On this day, I recall a customer came in the store and started to shop. It was a man, and he quickly went out of my sight, but not long after this, I saw him approaching and I thought he was maybe going to check out. But instead, he came up to me and asked me where the Hot Wheels were. I tried telling him the aisle, but he asked if I could just show him. I didn't really want to leave the check lanes unoccupied, but because not that many people were there, I did. I walked over and showed the man where they were, but when we got there, he started asking me more questions. I answered a few, but I soon told him that I really had to get back to the registers because nobody else was there. Then I walked back. I didn't quite know where my coworkers were, but I let the man know that there should be somebody else he can ask for help. I got back to the registers, and thankfully nobody was waiting or anything. Some time went by, and I noticed just a few people shopping from what parts of the store that I could see. After maybe 10 or 15 minutes, this one woman came up to me. She told me that some guy had been following her around the store. When she described him, I realized that it was the same man that I had talked to. Apparently, he had been closely following her, and when she asked him to leave her alone, he did not. This continued until the woman threatened to call the police, and apparently he finally backed off. She told me that she had just called the police and she wanted to let me know. The woman then waited with me until the police arrived, and in that time, I remember noticing the man quickly walking out of the store. Not long after, the police got there. They spoke with me and the woman, and then they left because the man did. I thought they were going to look around for him. After that, things pretty much went back to normal. Soon, things got busier, and another coworker joined me at the check lanes. I was kept pretty busy until several hours later, before close. When it was nighttime, things got really quiet again. Once more, it went back to me being the only cashier, and the store being very calm. I had some downtime where I was just waiting for people to check out. It was during this time that I noticed the man from earlier entering the store. I could not believe it. I wasn't sure if I should call the police right then and there or what, but instantly the man started walking in my direction. Surprisingly, he came right up to me and then asked me how much longer I had until I was off. I didn't really know what to do. I told the man I was working until close. He then started asking me a few more things, but the next thing I knew, I remember a coworker started to approach. When the man saw her, he just ran away and went farther into the store into a random aisle. I guess she had been there before when he had been stalking the other woman. After seeing him, my coworker started to chase after the guy. I then called the police and reported him for being back in the store. My coworker came back a short time later, asking me if the man had left. He had not, so we assumed that he was hiding someplace inside the store. The police got there quickly, and we told them that we thought the guy was hiding someplace. They looked around and were able to find him within probably 10 minutes. He had in fact been hiding in the store. He ended up getting banned from the Toys R Us. That was by far the craziest thing that ever happened when I worked there.
For several years, I've worked at an office building in the center of town. It's an online news and journalist company, and I'm one of the web developers. My job is usually just to make sure all the articles launch on the website properly, and to make sure the site runs smoothly and stays up 24/7. Now, we usually had an overnight worker, but he had recently quit, and so the company kind of forced me to fill in until they could find someone else. At first, I didn't mind. I mean, how bad could it be? But I learned pretty quick that it was awful. I was the only one in the building working overnight. I had no one to talk to, and really nothing to do. I would just have to sit there by myself in a huge empty office. On this night, I was lucky enough to have a small project to do. It wasn't much, just adding a page to the website, but it kept my mind occupied for an hour. Once I finished it though, I was back to just sitting and waiting. Eventually I got up and made a cup of coffee, and decided to take a walk around the building. I had never explored any of the other floors or rooms before, so I was both bored and curious. I stepped into the stairwell and walked up to the top floor. All the lights were off, except for the one in the hallway. I walked down and casually looked into a few rooms, but there wasn't anything interesting, so I started walking back to the stairwell. But then a sound came from below me. It was a door squeaking open, or at least it sounded exactly like it. I knew nobody else was in the building with me, so it sent a chill through my body. I quickly calmed myself though, and thought it was probably just a pipe in the walls, or the building making some other sound. I walked back down to the third floor, and began walking down the hallway toward my room, but something caught my eye. A door to one of the other rooms was open. I don't know why, but I felt like I remembered all the doors being closed. I didn't know if this was my brain playing tricks on me, or what, but for some reason, I just knew that door was closed. I walked over to it and looked into the room. It was a large office, just like mine, with rows of cubicles in the middle. All the lights were off, so only the thin line of light from the hallway seeped into the room. "Hello? Is someone in there?" I called out, but my voice echoed through the hollow room, with no reply. Another chill ran through me, and I closed the door, then went back to my office and sat at my desk. I chugged my coffee and rubbed my eyes, trying to get my head together. I checked the time, and it was a bit past 2 a.m., so I just had a few more hours to get through. I ended up scrolling through my emails and wasted another 10 minutes before I heard it again. That same exact sound, this time noticeably coming from somewhere on my floor. I stood up, and with my heart racing now, I hurried to the door leading into the hallway. I opened it and looked out. That same door across the hallway was now open again. I felt my stomach tighten and my body go numb. Something was seriously wrong now. I decided there was no better time to leave than right now, as I wasn't going to risk looking around again. I stepped into the hallway and started hurrying towards the stairs. As I did, I heard a footstep behind me. I quickly glanced back. There was a woman standing in the hallway, not far from the office I just came from. She looked disheveled, with tangled long dark hair, and her eyes wide open, making her look completely insane. I ran for the stairs and continued all the way down to the bottom floor. I heard her footsteps behind mine for a second, but then it sounded like she stopped chasing. I called the police once I felt I was safe. What's crazy is I had eyes on the back door, and the main hallway camera could see the front door, but when police showed up, they couldn't find her inside the building. None of the doors were unlocked or broken either, so how she got in or out is a mystery. For the next couple weeks, the company hired an overnight security guard, but I was still terrified. Every night, I would be constantly looking over my shoulder, thinking that woman could have snuck back inside, and with no other info on her, there's no saying what she was trying to do. This happened a few years ago. I was hopping between jobs a lot, struggling to find something that paid well enough for me to live on. I found myself working as a security guard for a large warehouse. When they hired me, it was pretty clear they'd never had a security guard before. They basically told me I just needed to walk the perimeter and make sure nobody broke in or stole anything. I found out a few days after getting hired from one of the employees that there had been a couple break-ins overnight recently, so that was the whole reason for hiring me. I probably should have been more worried than I was, but honestly I thought it was probably just because nobody was in the building overnight. So now that I was there, hopefully it wouldn't be an issue. The first 2 months were fine. Nothing happened at all. I never saw anyone come near the building on the cameras or had any encounters. Considering the pay and the lack of work I had to do, it was the easiest money of my life. Then, on a typical night, I came in at 11 and made sure all the employees and staff had left, then went around and locked the place up. I then went to the security office and double-checked the cameras were working properly and that there were no alerts, but I quickly noticed there was a flag on one of the doors. This meant it wasn't shut or locked properly. I had just gone around and shut and locked all the doors though, so I was reasonably confused. I got up and walked through the warehouse to the other side where the supposed unlocked door was. It was still closed, and the bolt looked like it was in still, but after a couple tries, it swung right open. I was really confused now. I looked outside just in case. The whole area around the warehouse was empty fields, and as far as I could see, there was nobody out there. I then turned my attention to the door. I tested the bolt, and it seemed to be okay, but the door would still open after a few tries. So then I looked at the notch in the door that the bolt slid into. Immediately, I found something strange. There was a small piece of wood sitting inside the hole. The way it was stuck inside there, it was very obvious that someone had put it there on purpose to keep the bolt from fully shutting. Having been on duty the night before and not seeing any alerts, this had to have been done recently too. I pulled it out and made sure the door was securely locked this time, then started making my way back to the security office to check the cameras. I wasn't sure if maybe an employee had done it earlier in the day for some reason, or if it was someone else, but as I was walking back, an uneasy feeling came over me, and I thought back to the break-ins I was warned about. The whole warehouse was quiet and dark, with only the dim energy-saving lights on, which didn't help me feel any better. I rounded the corner, just about making it to the office, when I saw something move by one of the storage racks. I could barely see anything, but I made out the shape of what I think was someone's head looking around one of the boxes. I quickly started walking again, trying to pretend like I didn't see them. I made it into the office and locked the door shut, then immediately used the phone to notify the police. My voice was shaky as I was completely terrified. I then put the phone down and logged back into the security system. I looked through each of the live feeds until I got to the one of the hallway I was in. I almost physically jumped from my seat when I saw the footage. There was a man standing right on the other side of the door. The view from the camera was far away, but there was no mistaking that he was holding a weapon in his hand. It looked like maybe a large knife, or even a small gun. I sat there in fear, panicking for the whole time I waited, thinking that this guy might shoot the lock off the door or something. After a few minutes though, he backed away. I followed him on the cameras as he went to the other side of the warehouse and exited through the door I'd just repaired. He then ran off into the fields behind the warehouse. The company and the police worked together to do an investigation, but nothing ever turned up from it. Of course, I quit not too long after that and moved on to a way less stressful job. To this day, I don't know why that man broke in or what he wanted. I work at a small retail store. It shouldn't be any surprise to hear that I hate it there. The work, the customers, even some of the co-workers. But it's my first job, and really the only one I was able to get with no experience. Over winter break, my school was out for 3 weeks, which meant I wasn't forced to only work closing shifts. I talked to my manager, who said I could take up a few overnight shifts if I wanted. I gladly accepted, knowing I wouldn't have to deal with customers and mostly get to work at my own pace. I knew the overnight manager, Chris, and when I came in for my first overnight, he showed me what to get done and left me to do it. It was just the two of us, working on opposite ends of the store. Being overnight though, it was really nice getting to work in peace and even listen to music as I did. But it only took a couple of hours for the fun of it to wear off. I was actually getting really bored and even a little sleepy, not talking to a single person. It was just past 1 a.m., so I let Chris know I was going to take my 15. I grabbed my lunch from the fridge in the break room, then left the building and sat in my car. I scarfed down my food, hoping to have 10 minutes for a quick nap. But before I rested my eyes, I noticed someone standing next to the building. The entire parking lot was empty and dark, with only the lights from inside the retail store on, so there was no reason for anyone to be here. The guy was looking into the windows like he was trying to see inside. It was so odd that I felt like I had to stay awake to watch the guy. He looked like a pretty tall dude with short hair wearing a dark leather jacket and some old boots. I watched him for the rest of my break, so a whole 10 minutes, and the guy still stood outside and was just watching in the windows of our store. Having the clock back in though, I got out and started walking toward the front doors. I was walking fast, hoping to slip by without the guy having a chance to stop me. But before I even got halfway through the parking lot, he spun around and looked at me. His eyes were dead and sleepless, and he had a blank face. I kept walking, trying to make it to the door, but the guy immediately started walking over to me. He was maybe 10 feet away as I came up and started unlocking the door, and he called out to me as I hurried inside and locked it behind me. I just ignored him out of a gut feeling that he was up to no good. Maybe it was harsh of me to not at least see what he wanted, but at the time, I just had a really bad feeling about him. I made my way to the back to use the bathroom, then was back on the sales floor a few minutes later. I wanted to get back to work, but I felt tempted to check on the front windows and see if the guy was still creeping around out there. So I walked up to the front, expecting to see his creepy eyes staring through the window, but he wasn't there, not even anywhere in the parking lot. I figured he left for good, so I went back to the aisle I was working in. Another few minutes went by. It was probably 1:30 by now, when suddenly the alarm sounded through the building. I knew exactly what it was right away. It was the back door that was in the storage area of the building. Sometimes the managers would toss stuff in the dumpster out back and accidentally trip the alarm. But with only Chris working, it seemed really unlikely. I started making my way to the back of the store, but the closer I got to the doors to the storage room, the more the bad feeling crept up inside of me. If it was Chris, surely he would have shut off the alarm by now. Then I got to the back, and just before I entered, I heard a bunch of thuds coming from the other side. I quickly pushed open the door, and the sound stopped. Down the large hallway, I could see the back door wide open, and there was no sign of Chris anywhere. "Chris?" I called out. He didn't respond, but instead, a moment later, a head peered around the corner on the other end of the hallway. I recognized that man's creepy dead look right away, and felt my whole body tense up. After hesitating, I went right back the way I came, not stopping for anything until I got outside and into my car. I called 911, and it was as I did that I realized I still had no idea where Chris was. Cops arrived quick though, running into the building and searching the whole place. Thankfully they found Chris unharmed. He had locked himself in the manager's office after the guy broke in and chased him. He also explained the thud noises I heard, saying the man was pounding on the office door and trying to break it down. The guy ran away as soon as I did, so he was gone before the cops could get to him. We have a blurry image of his face from the security cameras printed out and hung up on the back wall so other employees can keep a lookout for him. As far as we know, he hasn't come back, and there's no saying what he was trying to do that night. I'm just lucky that my gut feeling was working well that night. I'm a groundskeeper at the cemetery in our town. Despite popular belief, the job usually isn't that creepy. The only thing I find unsettling about the place is the couple of bells that are still left by some of the gravestones that have been there for almost 2 centuries. Most nights though, nothing at all happens, and I just go about my routine work. Sometimes a group of kids will show up, but as soon as they see me, they always run off. Since our town is relatively small, this is the only cemetery within several miles, so the graveyard is actually pretty big so that I can fit all of the stones. This was on a Thursday in the middle of summer. I'd shown up at 10 p.m. like usual and went into the small brick building that we called the outpost. It was a single room with some security screens and general maintenance tools, as well as a small bathroom. To start the night, I grabbed the keys and walked down to the main entrance gate and locked it up. While I was there, I noticed a man walking in the grass on the other side of the gate. He wore a black hoodie and was sort of walking along the fence only a few feet from where I was. I waited for a minute and watched him walk past the gate and continue along the fence, but seeing him do nothing else, I went back to the outpost. I put the keys back on the wall and stayed inside for a half hour while I looked over some things that the day workers had left me. Then at about 11, I grabbed the key to the runner and went out to get it from the shed. It was just a small ATV with a basket on the back for us to use when doing yard work. I pulled it out and started making my rounds to each gravestone, making sure there were no damages and picking up any flowers or other things left behind. We do this every Thursday, since most funerals are over the weekend, so that people have time to collect their items if they want to, but most people just leave them. Anyway, I drove around and collected some of the flowers, putting them in the back of the runner, when I saw a figure on the other side of the yard. Immediately, I looked around for any more people, trying to see if it was a group, but it was just the one guy. I started driving toward them, but even with the sound of the ATV, which was pretty loud, the guy didn't look at me. He stared ahead as he just kept walking through the yard. Thinking this guy was maybe in distress from a recent loss, I pulled up right next to him and tried to be polite at first. "I'm sorry, sir, but the yard is closed until tomorrow morning. I can give you a ride out." He continued walking, not even looking at me. I pulled up beside him again, and this time didn't go as easy on him. "You have to leave now, or the cops will have to get involved for trespassing." He finally stopped and looked at me. His eyes were red and wide open, and he was smiling. It was like a sad smile. I don't know, but it creeped me out. There was a couple seconds where neither of us said anything, before the guy lunged at me. He hit the side of the runner, and I was able to speed off before he grabbed me. I quickly turned around and headed straight for the outpost, calling 911 on my radio as I did. I parked the ATV outside and went into the security room, continuing to inform the police on the situation. The department is only a couple minutes away, so I holed up in the outpost and started looking through the security cameras to get any info on where the guy went. Before I could even find him on the screen though, loud banging shook the door behind me. He continuously hit the door like his life depended on it, enough to start shaking the floor and walls of the small building. There was nothing to defend myself with, so I just watched the door violently shake and hoped it wouldn't give in. I quickly checked with the dispatcher, and they told me to hold out just a bit longer, as the officers were only a minute away. Then, maybe 10 seconds later, the banging stopped, and I heard the guy sprinting away. I looked back at the screens to see which direction he ran in, and as soon as the officers arrived, I told them where he ran off to. After a quick look though, they didn't follow him. The way he ran was toward a bunch of trees, and there was no way to know how dangerous the guy was, so chasing him into the dark wasn't an option. I made an official report and everything, but weeks went by and nothing was found. I don't know if he was just in a fragile state of mind from a recent passing or what, but what happened that night likely won't ever have any answers.
The first couple years of college, I worked the third shift at my local Wendy's. The pay sucked, but it was pretty chill, other than the occasional late-night Karen. That was until I met Sandy. We hadn't gotten many customers that night, and I'd spent most of my shift sweeping and wiping the counters. Just when I thought I was going to die of boredom, someone pulled up to the drive-thru speaker. I put down the broom and turned on my headset. "Welcome to Wendy's, what can I get for you?" "I need 50 chicken nuggets and 10 double cheeseburgers." The man's voice sounded hoarse, but I thought it just might be the crappy Wendy's speakers. I punched in his order on the computer screen, feeling sorry for my coworker Brad in the kitchen. He was the only cook working, so he'd have to make all that food himself. "Is there anything else I can get you, sir?" The man stayed silent and drove up to the window beside me. His white pickup truck was rusty and dented. A thick layer of grime had built up on the windshield. The driver's side window was down, and I could see the man inside. His face was pale. His eyes had deep purple bags under them. He gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles were white. All down his arms were strange scars. It looked like his limbs had been gnawed on by a dinosaur. I forced myself not to stare and opened the window. "All right, that'll be $45.74, sir." I wrinkled my nose. A horrible stench came from the car. It smelled like a swamp. I was used to ocean stink since I lived in Florida, but this was 10 times worse. He didn't say anything. He just handed me a wrinkled $50 bill. I took the money, trying not to show my aversion to his scarred arms and stinky truck. One thing I learned from working in fast food: you want to avoid confrontation at all costs. I gave him his change and directed him to a parking spot we had reserved for larger orders. I told him I would bring out his food when it was ready, but he just stared at me with those soulless eyes. "Sandy's mighty hungry." When he opened his mouth, I could see rows of black teeth. "I'm sorry, what?" "Sandy's mighty hungry." Okay, sir. I'll bring out your food in a moment." I shut the window, but he still didn't go park in the spot I'd shown him. I dealt with my fair share of creeps, but this guy sent chills racing up my spine. I waited eagerly for Brad to start sending food through the pass-through window. But after 5 minutes, he'd only gotten out 20 nuggets and 2 burgers. The creep was tapping on the window with his gnarled hand. I took a deep breath and opened the window, wincing at the stinky swamp smell. Yes, sir?" "Sandy can't wait much longer. She's been waiting at the house all day." "I'm really sorry, sir. He's working on your food right now. I'll get it out to you as fast as I can." I shut the window, growing frustrated. Did he seriously expect there to not be a wait for all the food he ordered? And what kind of chick was Sandy if she sat at home all day and then demanded enough Wendy's to put someone in a coma? Not even 2 minutes passed before he tapped on the window again. I threw it open. "What do you want?" He shot out his hand and grabbed my shirt by the collar, yanking me close enough that I could smell his putrid breath. "Sandy's not gonna wait any longer. How would you like me to feed you to her?" "Get your hands off me!" I ripped his hands off my shirt and stumbled back into the window. "Get the hell out of here, I'm calling the cops!" The man snarled at me and pressed the gas. His car peeled out through the drive-thru. His taillights disappeared into the night. Good riddance. I went into the kitchen and told Brad that he made all that food for nothing. He was understandably upset, but we laughed it off and even ended up eating some of the burgers ourselves. About a half an hour passed with no customers, so me and Brad just kicked back in the kitchen and chatted. Right in the middle of our conversation, the power went out, plunging the kitchen into darkness. The stoves all clicked off, and the whir of the air conditioner stopped. We both thought it was weird since it wasn't even storming or anything. I followed Brad out of the kitchen. It was a little easier to see up front since there were no windows in the dining area, but it was still dark. Out of the front window, I could see the McDonald's across the street still glowing with electricity. All of the other buildings around us still seemed to have power. Only the Wendy's had lost electricity for some reason. Me and Brad both jumped and turned to the noise. The creep was back. He stood in front of the drive-thru window. He wasn't in his truck anymore. and this time he had a massive burlap sack clutched to his chest. His chapped lips were drawn in a sick grin. And to my horror, he pushed open the drive-thru window. "You need to feed Sandy." Brad stormed through the window, fuming. "Sir, you need to leave!" The creep opened the bag and tipped it into the restaurant. A dark mass fell with a plop onto the tile. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. And then, Brad screamed. I ripped my phone out of my pocket and turned on the flashlight. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. An alligator sat on the tile, its jaw locked firmly around Brad's ankle. Brad roared in pain. As blood splurted around the gator's mouth, I almost vomited as I watched it roll over, ripping Brad's foot off his ankle entirely. Brad wailed in pain. The nut job at the window started cackling. "Sandy's hungry! Sandy's hungry!" Brad stumbled backwards, but I caught him. His eyes fluttered back in his skull as I dragged him with me into the kitchen, slamming the door behind us. We both sat against the door to keep it shut. I called the cops immediately. It took them 10 minutes to get to us, and it was the longest 10 minutes of my life. All I could hear was that alligator scratching against the door and the weirdo just repeating "Sandy's hungry" over and over. The cops came and arrested that creep, and took the alligator named Sandy to a wildlife sanctuary somewhere. Apparently, the weirdo had captured the gator and kept it in his basement for years, feeding it fast food. I quit my job the next day and had to enroll in therapy. I still know I got lucky though. If I had been the one to go to the window, it would have been my foot in Sandy's stomach. As a busy mother of 3 living on a tight budget, the Walmart near my house is the most convenient and affordable option for my grocery shopping. The staff there is generally very nice and helpful, and I've never had any problems there, except for a few quality issues with meat and produce. Unfortunately, I've had to take a break from shopping there. I hope I can go back soon, but only time will tell. I had an encounter at Walmart that destroyed the feeling of security I used to have there. It started out like a normal shopping trip, which I do about once a week. As usual, while I was grabbing a cart, I said hello to the greeter, and we had a brief conversation. Since I go there so regularly, he recognizes me every time. He's a sweet old man, but other than that, we were both just going about our business. That day, however, I noticed something strange over his shoulder. Or rather, someone. In the open seating area of the subway at the front of the store, I saw a man staring at us, eating a sandwich while he sat facing the entrance. Even at a glance, I could tell something was weird about him. The greeter asked me if something was wrong, but I said I was fine and moved on. I thought it would be better to just get out of his eyesight and let him look at all the other people entering and exiting the store. I started my process of getting groceries, which after all these years of doing it every week, I've got it down to a system that keeps me from doing any backtracking and discourages me from getting lost in the areas where I might be tempted to buy things I don't need. For a while, I didn't notice anything obviously out of the ordinary, but at several instances, I did get the feeling I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, but I never saw anyone looking at me. Still, I was getting pretty on edge, so I hurried up to get out of the store faster. The last thing I needed to get were some pellets for my son's pellet rifle. While I was looking for the right kind of pellets, with one glance to the side, my suspicions were confirmed. At the end of the sporting goods aisle, a man was standing perfectly still and staring directly at me. It was the same man that stared me down from the subway. Upon this closer look, it was even more obvious that there was something wrong with him. His clothes were filthy, and he had this terrifying look in his eyes. I immediately turned the other way and headed for checkout. Every time I looked behind me, he was still following me. I got in line and was lucky enough to basically get right up to the cashier. The man following me grabbed a drink from a cooler and got in line to check out with the register next to me. Unsurprisingly, he got done before me and waited in the subway. When I was finished, I tried telling the cashier about him so they could maybe get the manager to do something about him. but they basically shooed me away so they could work through the line that had developed behind me. So instead, as I was leaving the store, I talked to the greeter. I pointed the stalker out and asked him to stall him for as long as he could. Then, I hurried out of the store to where my car was parked in the lot. I packed my groceries into the trunk as quickly as I could, but I wasn't fast enough. The stalker came running up to me and cornered me into the trunk of my car, where he began harassing me. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. I needed to tell you how beautiful you are.
Thanks, but, I'm married. Please, go away.
Oh no, no way. Not before I see if your feet are as beautiful as the rest of you.
What? No! Stay away from me!
Come on, just let me get a quick pic of your feet, that's all.
What? No! Stay away from me! Ew! You're not getting any pictures of me, you sick pervert!
Stop being such a prude! All you gotta do is take off your shoes!
Hell no! Somebody help me!
Fine, I'll do it for you! That's when he tried to rip off my shoes. I tried to kick him away, but every time my shoe connected with his face, he seemed to enjoy it, making me much more crazed. For some reason, nobody in the parking lot came over to do anything about my screaming. It wasn't that hard for my shoes to come off, and then my socks. Once I was barefoot, the creep took out his phone and took a picture of my feet. I thought it would be over then. At that point, I let him get that far out of a mixture of shock and fear. But then, he took it even further. He grabbed my foot and lifted it up to his nose. He took a deep whiff, but it didn't even end there. Oh yeah. Your feet smell so good, lady. Let me get a taste, too.
What the hell?
As soon as his tongue touched my toe, my other foot acted out of pure instinct and kicked him square in the eye. He released me and fell back onto the ground. He looked up at me with surprise and a bit of fear. I guess at that moment he decided he had enough, because he got up and ran off. Only after the threat had passed did someone come up and offer help, and it turned out to be the greeter. Apparently, after stalling the creep for just a second, the poor old man got shoved to the ground as the creep ran out to catch up to me. Thankfully, he wasn't hurt, but at his age, a fall like that could have been serious. We called the police and I reported what happened. When the Walmart manager reviewed the store security footage per police request, they were able to confirm that the creep had been stalking me all over the store. It's for that reason I don't know if I could ever go back to Walmart. I certainly miss the prices and the convenience, but I'll never forget what I experienced in that parking lot. According to Reddit user u/Suavecore, an apparent Walmart employee responding to a thread in the Walmart subreddit, the craziest thing that ever happened in their store happened about a year ago in 2023. The stalking of a woman in her mid-40s by a man in his early 20s originated inside the store. The stalker was seen on security footage following the woman around the store and waiting for her in the subway while she checked out. As she left the store, she was followed to her car. According to what the woman told the police, the man told her that she was beautiful and talked with her for a few seconds before suddenly ripping her shoes off and smelling her feet, while the woman held onto the car in shock. Shortly after, he fled to his car and drove away. The Reddit user alluded to the fact that the man lives a few hours away in the same state, which would imply that he has been identified. But unfortunately, there's no information about whether or not he's been arrested and charged for the incident. I've been shopping at Walmart for 25 years, and I never experienced anything crazy there before. That was until last week. I think if this happened to anyone without the sort of training I got from the military, it could have ended much worse. At the beginning of spring, when the temperature started going back up, this guy in front of my local Walmart started selling water bottles out of a cooler for $1. I saw him outside the entrance every time I went shopping for a few months. I could never tell if he was homeless or not, but I always assumed he was. It never bothered me since I don't work at Walmart and I don't have any reason to care. But I never bought anything from him. I know it's going to be hot outside when I leave the house. I bring water with me. Simple as that. When I went shopping last week, He was there just like usual. He seemed a little agitated that day and was being pushier than usual. As I walked up to the door, he singled me out and stepped out in front of me, trying to get me to buy water. I refused and tried to walk around him, but he continued to block me from entering the store, and he became even more aggressive with his tactics. Come on, you're telling me a big husky boy like you isn't thirsty in this heat? Buy a water, man, it's ice cold. And you think insulting me is going to work? Back off, I'm not buying. What's your problem, man? I'm trying to help you out and you're yelling in my face? Just ask someone else, dude. I'm done with this. Eventually, I walked past him and got into the store, but he followed me inside, continuing to shout at me to buy a bottle of water. An employee at the front of the store quickly confronted him. They argued for a moment, but eventually the man finally let it go and left. I had a long grocery list as I usually do, so I wanted to get through it. My first item on the list was canned food. The aisle wasn't far from the entrance, and it didn't take me long to get there. I stopped my cart and reached down to grab the green beans on the lower shelf, when all of a sudden, someone hit me in the back of the head. I was completely caught off guard. By the time I could even turn around, I had already been hit several times. The attacker hit me right in my eyes. I was so disoriented that I couldn't even tell how many people there were, or who they were. It felt like I was being jumped by 3 or 4 people. I tried to step back and make space, but they stayed right on me the whole time. I finally put up my defenses and got my first good look at my attacker. It was that same man from before. He kept punching me in the face. I pushed him back only for him to rush forward and grab me by the arm and keep hitting me. I fought back by punching him in the chin several times, but somehow he was unfazed. I couldn't escape his hold on me, so I reached into my pocket for my knife. I pulled it out and put it to his throat, demanding he let me go. He grabbed it instead. We fought over the knife, trading blows with our other hands. When both of our hands were grabbing at the handle, he resorted to kicking me in the groin. Due to the shock of the pain, my focus on the knife slipped for a moment, and that's when he grabbed it. I staggered back, trying to make space. The attacker paused, smirking with success. For a moment, time slowed to a crawl. The threat to my life had just been severely intensified. I got my bearings on my surroundings, noticing for the first time that we were actually surrounded by a crowd of people. But instead of doing anything to help me, they had taken out their phones and were filming. I had no time to feel injustice, though. The attacker lunged at me, thrusting the knife through the air. Just then, an old muscle memory came back to me. A piece of CQC training from boot camp when I was 18 years old. 25 years later, I used it for the first time in a real-life scenario. I quickly blocked the rushing attack and disarmed the man as he tried to stab me, grabbing a hold of it myself. My muscle memory also led me to stab the man twice without even thinking about it. Luckily, I only hit his arms. He shouted in pain and tripped over himself, collapsing to the ground. I stood there in a queasy state, wondering if he was going to get up and come at me, wondering if I would have to stab him again. Thankfully, when he got to his feet, he turned around and ran right out of the store. Nobody tried to stop him, and I didn't go after him. I was pretty shaken up, both by the attack itself and with what I had proven myself to be capable of so automatically. Some people finally came up to me, and after talking with them for a while, I felt mostly normal again. A bit later, the police showed up, as well as a news crew. I gave my statements to the police and then figured I should agree to do an interview with the reporters while the memory was fresh. This wasn't the way I envisioned I'd be on the news if I ever did. One of the strangest things to me is that after everything, at the end of the day, I still needed to get groceries. When I returned to shopping, I had to go back to the exact same spot where it happened, right in front of the can of green beans. As I reached down to grab them, I had a flashback to the fight. At the time, I didn't realize he was saying anything, but suddenly I remembered him screaming about something. It was the reason why he was attacking me. His cooler full of water had been stolen while he was in the store with me, and somehow he blamed me for it. He was trying to punch my teeth in for stealing his cooler. I really don't understand this world. On June 14, 2024, a man named Lonnie Blanzett was attacked while shopping at Walmart in Shreve City, Louisiana. Blanzett gave a detailed account of the ensuing battle to local news reporters, in which he describes being absolutely surprised by the attack. As he struggled to make sense of what was going on and defend himself, the Blanzett turned to two weapons on his person. We chose not to depict the struggle over the first weapon here on YouTube, but it follows the same line of events as the second. The attacker was able to take the knife out of Blanzett's hands, but luckily he was able to regain possession of it, at which point he stabbed his attacker twice. The attacker then fled the store. Blanzett remarked that there were onlookers filming him fighting for his life, instead of doing anything to help him. Despite this, no footage of the fight was able to be found. Apparently, that's just the sort of thing people like to keep in their camera roll and look back on every once in a while. 4 years ago, I was a regular shopper at Walmart. In March of 2020, when the virus was starting to get out of control, and everyone was worried about it becoming a full-blown apocalypse, I decided it was a good time to stock up on supplies. I put on my mask and walked into Walmart with a couple $100 to spare, and I was immediately caught off guard by the pandemonium I had just stepped into. Don't get me wrong, trips to Walmart in daytime have never been relaxing, but I'd never seen so much desperation and panic before. People were scurrying around like rats, loading up on huge amounts of everything they could get their hands on, and ironically, the store was packed, but only half of the people in there were wearing masks. Taking one of the last remaining carts, I started combing through the aisles and picking up everything on my list. I couldn't afford to get heaps of stuff, so I spread out my budget to the bare necessities. Batteries, shelf-stable food, water, that sort of thing. And yes, I was only able to get a single small pack of one-ply toilet paper because that was all that was left. Aside from the general atmosphere of the store being in historical turmoil, there was one other unusual event I clearly remember. I was in the canned foods aisle. Naturally, there were quite a few other people in there. Everybody was in their own world, grabbing what they could with tunnel vision. However, one guy was out of place. He didn't have a card or a mask. He wasn't even carrying anything. But he was standing at the end of the aisle just a few feet from me. As I picked up a can of beans, I saw him smile like a creep out of the corner of my eye. I glanced over and he looked away. Then he walked off, quietly laughing. At the time, I figured he was just some nutjob in denial of the whole situation, getting some kick out of watching everyone scramble for resources. Maybe he was amused by me in particular, wearing a mask meant for a doctor while I grasped intently for the cheapest can of beans in Walmart. I even laughed at myself a little bit too. There was something morbidly entertaining about those times. Acknowledging that helped me get through it all. Regardless, I quickly forgot about him and went about my business. I finished up my shopping and went home. I put all my stuff away and then sat down on the couch. Foolishly, I forgot to wash my hands until a few minutes later. But by then I was pretty sure I already touched my face. Oh well, I thought. The next day, I was sicker than I'd ever been in my life. I didn't need a test to know what I had. That disease felt unlike any sickness I had ever experienced. Within hours, I was too weak to walk. I was overcome with fever and chills. By nightfall, I was coughing horribly. When I wasn't coughing, I was trying to breathe with what felt like a bowling ball in my chest. The next morning, after a fitful sleep, I began vomiting. I threw up everything I had in my stomach. Then I dry heaved until it was time to turn around and dump everything out the other end too. I struggled to keep down a sip of water, much less a bite of food. Luckily, I didn't live alone, but it wasn't like I had a loving wife to take care of me. I had a roommate on the other side of my apartment. We quarantined ourselves to our respective rooms, but it didn't stop him from catching it too. For some reason, however, the strange nature of the disease meant that his case was far less severe. He described it as a mild flu, which he was able to recover from in just a few days. I, on the other hand, was bedridden for a week. My roommate helped me with a few things, mostly just checking in on me periodically to make sure I didn't need to go to the hospital. Eventually, I did start to feel better. My fever was gone and I could eat again, albeit slowly. It seemed like my body had defeated the virus. Unfortunately, it took another week for my body to fully recover from the damage that had been done. 15 days after contracting the virus, I finally felt back to my old self. I waited another week before going out as recommended, but that was easy to do because of everything I had bought before getting sick. Although, after about another week, I needed to go out and get a few things. Once again, I put on my mask and headed over to Walmart. I didn't need to stock up on as much as I did last time, so it was a much shorter trip. Also, by then, the lockdown was in full effect, so barely anyone was in the store. I'd run out of all my canned foods, so that was one of the things I needed. I didn't expect to see anyone when I entered the canned food aisle, but I never would have guessed in a million years what I saw in that moment. The same man who I caught staring at me 3 weeks prior was standing right where I stood in that interaction. He was holding a can of beans up to his mouth, licking it all over. I stopped and stared in shock, watching in absolute disbelief. This wasn't just some little lick. It was a full-on makeout session, a showcase in canned cunnilingus. This persisted for several torturous seconds before the creep finally noticed me. What? Are you afraid of a little cold? You disgusting freak! Overcome with rage, I grabbed a can and chucked it at his face. It nailed him in the side of his head as he tried to block it. Then I grabbed another can, and that sent him running. I didn't chase after him. Obviously, I didn't want to be anywhere near him. Nobody had been around for the interaction, but I reported him to the management. After reviewing the security footage, they said they'd look into it. But then, they banned me for assaulting a customer and damaging merchandise. Needless to say, I haven't shopped at Walmart since. Later, I found out that sicko had been licking items in Walmart for weeks. Somehow, nobody in the store noticed. What's more, he was actively posting himself in the act on social media. It apparently took dozens of reports to police to get them to arrest him. But eventually, they finally did. I can't say 100% that he's the reason I got so sick. On March 11, 2020, a 26-year-old man in Missouri named Cody Lee Feister posted a video of himself licking deodorants in Walmart, poking fun at anyone who would be concerned about the potential consequences. Weeks later, after numerous calls from local residents, and even calls from the other side of the world, police finally arrested Feister. One has to wonder how many other items he may have contaminated off camera, and by extension, just how many people could have fallen ill due to his actions. It is unknown if Feister tested positive for the virus at the time, but it doesn't make him any less disgusting.
This happened about 5 years ago. I was working and it was 12 p.m., time for my lunch break. I worked in an office building right near the city. From my job, there were a few places that I could go to get food. Sometimes I would also bring my own lunch. However, on this day, I walked over to Subway. It took me maybe about 5 minutes to walk there from my building, so it was very convenient and I went there all the time. I just had to walk down a sidewalk, turn, and go down another one for a short distance. But on this day, when I got inside of the Subway, I noticed that there was a really long line. I considered going someplace else, but decided not to. Most places were pretty busy at this time, because many people like me were on their lunch breaks. So I stood there and hoped that the line would move quickly. As the line moved, more people entered the Subway and the line grew behind me. It was moving at a decent rate though. I remember when I had been inside for at least 5 minutes, I felt my phone vibrating in my pocket. I was getting a phone call, and I took my phone out to see who it was that was calling me. But when I looked, I did not recognize the number. So at that point, I put my phone back in my pocket. But just moments later, after the call ended, I felt my phone vibrate from receiving a text. So I once more took out my phone and looked at it. At this point, it was nearing my turn to order and there were maybe 2 or 3 people ahead of me. When I looked at the text, it was from the same unknown number that had just called me. The text said, "I'm in line behind you." I was confused after reading this. Was this a work friend pranking me or something? I instantly turned around and looked. By now, at least 10 people were in line behind me, but I didn't recognize anyone. The person directly behind me was a woman who I had never seen before, and she was not on her phone or anything. I didn't really think it would be her, but everybody else looked like total strangers as well. Some of them stared at me now because I had completely turned around and was looking at everybody. I turned back and texted the number asking who it was. However, they did not immediately respond. This was really weird, but soon it was my turn and I ordered. After getting my sub, I left the Subway restaurant, but before walking out, took a look at everybody in there once again. I still didn't notice anybody strange and didn't recognize anyone. So I left the Subway and walked back to my job. There was a decent amount of other people out on the sidewalk too, because we were so close to the city, but nothing stood out as strange there either. So I got back to work and went the rest of the day without anything weird happening. I left work at 5 p.m. and started to drive home. It took between 15 and 20 minutes to drive back to my house. I remember that when I was driving on the highway, I got another phone call. It was from that same unknown number. This time, I decided to answer it. When I did, a voice that seemed to be a male's spoke. He said in a whispery voice that he was driving behind me. I asked who it was, but the guy then hung up. Once more, I was very confused. I looked in my mirror and did not notice anything out of the ordinary. There was nobody riding my tail or anything. The highway was very busy though, and it was rush hour. So there were tons of other cars on the road behind me. It could have been any of them. I continued to drive home, but didn't want to go to my house. So when I got to my exit, instead of driving home, I drove to the police station. When I got there, I didn't notice anybody follow me in. Then I went inside and I told them about what happened. But unfortunately, there wasn't really anything that could be done. They said it was more than likely just a prank, but to not hesitate to call if anything else happens. So after that, I blocked the number that had been messing with me, and I drove the rest of the way home. I wasn't followed by anyone, and after that day, I received no more strange texts or calls. Maybe that was just a prank, but I still don't know who did it or why. I mentioned it to several friends, and nobody ever took responsibility. It remains a mystery to me to this day.